Why Israel matters. The eyes of the world are fixed on the volatile Middle East, where tensions, such as those between Iran and Israel, ripple across the global stage. Israel, a nation no larger than New Jersey, stands at the heart of this geopolitical maelstrom, surrounded by complex alliances and age-old rivalries. Yet, despite its modest size, Israel commands an outsized presence. Its history, stretching back millennia, is a tapestry of triumph, tragedy, and resilience. From the ancient kingdoms of David and Solomon to the modern state born in 1948, Israel has weathered invasions, exiles, and wars that have shaped the course of human civilization. Today, it boasts a cutting-edge economy, a thriving tech sector dubbed the Startup Nation, and a military prowess that belies its small footprint. How did this tiny land, sacred to three major faiths, become a global powerhouse? Join us on a journey through story of history, faith, and conflict to uncover why Israel, a land of enduring significance, continues to captivate and challenge the world. Part 1. Introduction to Israel's significance. Tucked between the eastern Mediterranean Sea and the arid deserts of Arabia lies a land so small it can be crossed from one side to the other in just a few hours. Israel, barely the size of the U.S. state of New Jersey, does not stand out on a map. And yet, this narrow strip of earth has commanded attention, reverence, and controversy for millennia. Its name echoes through the pages of history, through scripture, through diplomatic halls and battlefields. How can a country so small wield such influence across religion, politics, and global consciousness? To understand Israel's significance, one must first understand its geography, not just its borders, but its placement at the meeting point of civilizations. The land of Israel lies at the junction where Africa, Asia, and Europe converge. In ancient times, it served as a natural bridge between empires. Armies marched through its valleys, merchants traded in its markets, and prophets spoke in its hills. The people who lived here, whether shepherds, kings, or exiles, were shaped by this constant flow of cultures, beliefs, and power. The ancient Jewish people trace their lineage to this land. Their stories, of exile and return, of faith and law, of struggle and survival, are deeply tied to its hills and plains. Though they were often scattered across the world, they never lost their spiritual connection to the land they called home. For Jews, Israel has always been more than soil. It is covenant, memory, and hope. But Israel is not only significant to Jews. Christians revere it as the land where Jesus walked, taught, and was crucified. Muslims hold it sacred as the site of the Prophet Muhammad's night journey. Jerusalem, one of the world's most contested cities, is home to holy sites central to all three Abrahamic religions. And so this single city, barely 50 square miles, carries the spiritual weight of billions. In the modern age, Israel's story became one of rebirth against all odds. After nearly 2,000 years without a sovereign homeland, the Jewish people re-established a state in 1948. From that moment forward, Israel has been a symbol of resilience, of conflict, of promise. Wars were fought to defend it. Peace was brokered, then broken. The Middle East reshaped itself again and again around this nation's presence. Yet Israel is also a country of paradoxes. It is ancient and modern. It guards traditions from thousands of years ago while fostering one of the world's most dynamic technology sectors. It was born from the trauma of exile and genocide, yet faces ongoing debates about its own identity and policies. It is both a haven for Jews worldwide and a focal point of international scrutiny. And it is home to a population that includes Jews, Muslims, Christians, Druze, and others, many of whom hold competing visions for its future. This series does not aim to pick a side. It does not seek to inflame or to simplify. Instead, it invites you on a journey. Through myth and memory. Through archaeology and scripture. Through wars and treaties, hopes and heartbreaks. Each episode will trace a piece of Israel's long, tangled story, from prehistoric beginnings in the southern Levant, to the rise and fall of ancient kingdoms, to the emergence of modern Zionism, and the wars that shaped the Middle East as we know it. Israel's history is not just a timeline. It is a mirror, reflecting the deepest questions of identity, belonging, justice, and survival. Whether revered or reviled, the land and the people bound to it have never been ignored. And so, as we begin this exploration, we ask not just why Israel matters, but what it means for a land to carry so much memory, so much meaning, for so many. The road ahead is long. But it is a road paved with some of humanity's oldest footprints, and it begins here. Part 2, Prehistoric and Early Canaanite Roots. Long before prophets carved commandments into stone and kings ruled from fortified hills, the land that would one day be called Israel was already a cradle of human life. In deep time, 10,000 years before any alphabet was etched into clay, this stretch of earth lay at the center of a primal crossroads. Here, between the cool forests of Europe and the dry heat of Africa, early humans wandered, hunted, and settled. And here, in the wild hills and river valleys of what we now call the southern Levant, the first sparks of civilization began to stir. Archaeologists call the earliest culture of this region the Natufians, a name that sounds as ancient and mysterious as the people themselves. They appeared around 12,000 years ago, at the tail end of the last ice age. Unlike the nomadic hunters who had come before them, the Natufians began to settle. Their homes were built with stone foundations, often circular in shape, and nestled into the hillsides near streams and wild grain fields. These were among the first human beings to live in something resembling a village. With flint sickles and bone tools, they harvested wild barley and wheat, storing it in woven baskets. They buried their dead with care, sometimes under the floors of their homes, surrounded by animal bones or carved pendants, suggesting a culture that honored memory and the invisible threads between life and death. In their grave goods and grinding stones, we find whispers of a society slowly learning to shape the land instead of merely wandering through it. As centuries passed, these early settlers evolved. They learned to domesticate animals, cultivate crops, and fire clay pottery. The Neolithic Revolution, so often associated with Mesopotamia, unfolded quietly here too, along the Jordan River, in the Galilee highlands, and in the limestone caves of Carmel. These ancient people had no nation. They left no writing. But they built the foundation upon which all later civilizations in this land would rise. By the 3rd millennium BCE, the region entered the Bronze Age, and the first signs of urban life emerged. The Canaanites, an umbrella term for the various peoples who lived in this area, constructed fortified cities with thick walls and stone temples. Their cities, like Hazor, Megiddo, and Jericho, grew into thriving centers of trade and ritual. They traded cedar wood, olive oil, wine, and copper with neighbors in Egypt, Anatolia, and Mesopotamia. In return, they received gold, textiles, and exotic ideas. The Canaanite pantheon was as diverse and restless as the people who worshipped it. Gods like El, Baal, Asherah, and Anat ruled over sky, storm, fertility, and war. These deities were often represented by towering stone stelae or by small clay figurines hidden in household shrines. Temples rose in city centers, often accompanied by storehouses and altars blackened with generations of offerings. But the most striking legacy of the Canaanites may be found not in their temples, but in their influence. Their alphabet, developed around 1800 BCE, was one of the earliest phonetic writing systems in the world, and would eventually evolve into Phoenician, Hebrew, Greek, Latin, and beyond. A script born from the scribes of ancient Canaan would someday shape the words you are hearing now. Even amid the ruins of these early towns, the pulse of daily life remains visible. Ovens for baking bread, basins for fermenting beer, wells dug deep into limestone. Children played in courtyards. Women ground grain at dawn. Farmers bent low over barley fields. Priests whispered prayers to a dozen gods, hoping the rains would come. This land was not yet called Israel. But already, it was becoming something more than a patch of soil. It was a place where past and present layered over one another, where footsteps never faded completely. A land of memory, where every stone held a story. As we move forward in our journey through time, we will encounter shepherds and patriarchs, prophets and kings. But before all of them, there were the nameless thousands who broke the first ground, who built the first homes, and who dreamed, perhaps not so differently than we do, of belonging somewhere, of living with purpose, and of leaving something behind. Part 3, the biblical narrative of Jewish origins. Somewhere amid the endless desert winds and starlit skies of the ancient Near East, a man stood beneath the heavens and listened. His name, according to tradition, was Abram, later called Abraham, and the voice he heard was not that of thunder or king, but something more profound. A whisper from beyond, calling him to leave his home, to journey to a land he did not know, and to trust in a promise that would echo for millennia. It is from this moment that the biblical story of Israel begins, not with a throne or an empire, but with a journey of faith. The Hebrew Bible, what Christians later called the Old Testament, is not merely a religious text. It is, at its heart, a national memory. Its stories form the spiritual spine of the Jewish people. It tells of Abraham and his wife Sarah, of their son Isaac, and grandson Jacob, whose 12 sons would become the ancestors of Israel's tribes. These early patriarchs wandered through the land of Canaan, pitching tents, digging wells, making covenants, and building altars. They were shepherds and nomads, but the land beneath their feet was already heavy with destiny. This land, later called the Promised Land, was more than soil. It was covenant. According to the biblical narrative, God promised Abraham that his descendants would inherit this land, a promise renewed with Isaac and Jacob. For generations, this promise sustained a people who often found themselves far from home. One of the most defining chapters in this narrative is the story of the Exodus, the dramatic tale of Israelite bondage in Egypt and their liberation under the leadership of Moses. With signs and wonders, plagues and parted seas, the story moves with cinematic drama. But its heart lies at Mount Sinai, where Moses receives the Torah, the divine law that would guide the Jewish people through exile, return, and centuries of wandering. Here, the covenant deepened. Israel was no longer just a people tied by blood, but a nation bound by law and purpose. The commandments given at Sinai shaped every corner of life: justice, ritual, community, even the treatment of strangers. You were strangers in the land of Egypt, the law reminds, urging compassion. This ancient memory of suffering became a cornerstone of Jewish ethics, and even today, echoes in Jewish thought. Yet the biblical story is not one of triumph alone. It is filled with struggle, famine, family betrayal, exile. Even the heroes are flawed. Abraham questions, Jacob deceives, Moses doubts. The text does not shy away from human frailty, but embraces it, presenting a people who learn, fail, repent, and persist. Of course, historians and archaeologists have long debated how much of this narrative reflects actual events. There is little consensus on whether the patriarchs lived, or whether the Exodus happened as described. Yet what cannot be denied is the power of these stories, their ability to shape identity, to sustain hope, and to root a people across time and place. For Jewish communities scattered across continents, the tales of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Moses offered more than nostalgia. They were maps of meaning. They reminded each generation of who they were, where they came from, and where they believed they were meant to return. As the Israelites wandered the deserts and returned to Canaan, their identity became inseparable from the land. Not as conquerors seeking plunder, but as a people seeking fulfillment of a divine promise. Whether in times of joy or ruin, this spiritual bond would endure. Even in the darkest exiles, the name Zion, another name for Jerusalem, remained a beacon, sung in psalms and prayers, whispered over graves, and etched into the hearts of children. In the next part of our journey, we will see this people transform from wandering tribes into a united kingdom. But before they had kings or temples, they had stories. Stories that taught them to remember, to believe, and above all, to hope. In a land often divided by war and belief, that hope may be Israel's oldest inheritance, and its most enduring. Part 4, the United Monarchy, c. 11th century BCE. By the time the Israelites had settled among the hills and valleys of Canaan, their identity had been shaped by centuries of migration, covenant, and survival. Yet they remained a scattered people, 12 tribes loosely held together by shared ancestry and faith, but often divided by geography, rivalries, and threats from the powerful neighbors around them. The Philistines to the west, the Arameans to the north, and the Moabites and Ammonites across the Jordan were not mere shadows, they were armies, kings, and empires in waiting. Faced with constant danger and internal discord, the Israelites longed for unity and strength. They longed for a king. The book of Samuel captures this turning point with drama and ambivalence. The prophet Samuel, the last of the judges, warned the people what kings would do: tax their goods, conscript their sons, and rule with power. But the people insisted. "We want to be like the other nations," they cried, "with a king to lead us and fight our battles." And so, the first king of Israel was chosen, Saul, a tall man from the tribe of Benjamin, anointed in secret with oil and proclaimed before the people. Saul's reign began with promise. He rallied the tribes, struck down Israel's enemies, and held the fragile kingdom together. But his rule was marked by instability and disobedience. The Bible describes a king plagued by jealousy and isolation, ultimately rejected by God. Into this breach stepped a young shepherd from Bethlehem, a boy named David, whose life would forever alter the destiny of Israel. David's rise from harp-playing courtier to warrior, fugitive, and finally king is a story threaded with poetry and blood. He slew Goliath with a sling and a stone, but his greatest victories came not on the battlefield, but in his ability to unite the tribes and win their hearts. When he became king over all Israel, he chose Jerusalem, a neutral site between the northern and southern tribes, as his capital. It was a brilliant stroke of politics and faith. The city, once held by the Jebusites, became the beating heart of a new kingdom. David brought the Ark of the Covenant, the sacred chest that symbolized God's presence, into Jerusalem with dancing and music. He wrote psalms that are still sung today, melodies of lament and praise, love and longing. But he was also a man of contradictions. He committed sins, made enemies, and saw his own family fracture. His life, like that of his people, was marked by faith and failure in equal measure. After David came Solomon, his son by Bathsheba, whose reign was remembered as a golden age. Solomon built the first temple on Mount Moriah, a majestic structure of cedar and gold, where sacrifices were offered and prayers rose like incense. The temple was more than a place of worship, it was a symbol of permanence, of the covenant etched not just in law, but in stone. Solomon's wisdom became legend. He judged disputes, composed proverbs, and welcomed visitors from across the known world. His alliance with the Queen of Sheba, his fleets that sailed to Ophir, his diplomatic marriages, all testified to Israel's newfound prominence. The kingdom stretched from the Euphrates to Egypt, and for a brief moment, Israel stood as a unified, respected, and radiant force in the region. Yet beneath the grandeur, cracks formed. Heavy taxation to fund lavish projects, growing discontent among the tribes, and hints of idolatry in Solomon's later years sowed the seeds of future division. After his death, the fragile unity unraveled. But for a time, there had been one nation, one king, one God worshipped in one temple. The period of the United Monarchy, whether fully historical or partly symbolic, left an indelible mark on Jewish memory. David became the archetype of the Messiah, Solomon the model of wisdom, Jerusalem the eternal capital. In later centuries of exile and despair, these kings would be remembered not just for what they were, but for what they represented, a moment when the scattered became one, when the dream of a righteous kingdom seemed possible. In the next chapter of our story, that unity will fracture. But the echoes of David's harp and Solomon's prayers will remain, vibrating through centuries of longing and return. Part 5. Division into Israel and Judah. The golden glow of Solomon's reign faded with his passing, and what followed was not celebration, but uncertainty. The people of Israel, once united under a single king and a single temple, began to feel the weight of what had held them together, and what might now pull them apart. As Solomon's son, Rehoboam, ascended to the throne, the unity that had taken generations to forge stood on a knife's edge. Rehoboam traveled to Shechem to be crowned, but the mood was not jubilant. The northern tribes, burdened by Solomon's taxes and forced labor, arrived not only to witness a coronation but to issue a plea: lighten the yoke, ease the burdens, and we will serve you. It was a moment that required wisdom, restraint, and vision. Instead, Rehoboam responded with arrogance. "My father scourged you with whips," he declared. "I will scourge you with scorpions." With those words, the bond was broken. 10 tribes turned their backs on the house of David. Under the leadership of Jeroboam, a former official who had fled Solomon's wrath years earlier, they declared a new kingdom, the Kingdom of Israel, ruling from the northern cities of Shechem and later Samaria. Only the tribes of Judah and Benjamin remained loyal to Rehoboam, forming the southern kingdom of Judah, centered around Jerusalem and the Temple. Thus, the once unified kingdom split in two nations, two kings, two paths diverging in the shadow of a fractured past. The division was more than political. It was cultural, religious, and deeply personal. The northern kingdom, distant from Jerusalem's temple, established its own centers of worship in Bethel and Dan, complete with golden calves and altars. Critics in the south called it idolatry, those in the north called it necessity. The prophets would later condemn these choices, but for many, it was simply the price of independence. Rivalries grew. Israel and Judah, though kin by blood and scripture, often found themselves at odds, sometimes allies in war, more often enemies. Kings rose and fell in rapid succession, especially in the north, where palace intrigue and assassination were frequent. Dynasties were short-lived. Loyalty was fickle. Yet both kingdoms clung to a shared heritage. They still told the stories of Abraham and Moses, still remembered the covenant, still offered sacrifices to the God of Israel. But their interpretations, their rituals, and even their languages began to diverge over time. The split had become more than a schism, it had become an evolution. Archaeological discoveries offer glimpses of these changes. In the north, large fortresses and administrative centers suggest a kingdom thriving with trade and military organization. Inscriptions hint at the worship of multiple deities alongside Yahweh, reflecting a more syncretic religious culture. In the south, Jerusalem remained a religious capital, but also grew into a bureaucratic center, with scribes and priests asserting their authority through texts and temple rituals. The prophets, Elijah, Elisha, Amos, Hosea, and later Isaiah and Jeremiah, walked among the people during this time, crying out for justice and warning of doom. Their voices thundered against the backdrop of luxury and oppression, idol worship and empty ritual. They called for a return, not just to Jerusalem, but to righteousness. Their words would be preserved for generations, their visions etched into the fabric of history. But the political division would not heal. The kings of Israel and Judah died, and their sons took their thrones. Armies marched. Cities burned. Peace was fleeting. Still, in every home, from Samaria to Jerusalem, candles were lit on Sabbaths, prayers whispered at dawn, children told stories of a God who had once led slaves to freedom and promised a land of their own. The people were divided, but their yearning was shared. As we move forward, the northern kingdom will face its end, not in rebellion or civil war, but in the crushing grip of a foreign empire. The story of the 10 lost tribes begins not in legend, but in conquest. Yet even in their disappearance, they would leave behind a haunting echo of what was lost and what might still be found. Part 6: Assyrian Conquest and the Lost Tribes. The northern kingdom of Israel, carved out in defiance of David's line, endured for 2 centuries. Its kings built cities and led armies, its people tilled fertile hills and raised families in stone houses and sun-drenched courtyards. But beneath the daily rhythm of life, the land trembled under the footsteps of giants. To the northeast, the Assyrian Empire was rising, not with the slow swell of tide, but with the crash of a storm. The Assyrians were ruthless and methodical. They built roads to move their armies swiftly, scribes to record their victories, and siege engines to break the strongest of walls. Their kings, Tiglath-Pileser III, Shalmaneser V, Sargon II, dreamed not only of conquest, but of dominion, of breaking nations and remaking them in the Assyrian mold. Israel, fractured by political instability and religious division, stood in their path. At first, there were uneasy alliances. Kings of Israel paid tribute, hoping to buy peace with gold, livestock, and hostages. But peace with Assyria was a mirage. Each payment only delayed the inevitable. Each act of defiance brought swift punishment. In time, resistance was not just a gamble, it was a death sentence. In 722 BCE, Samaria, the proud capital of the northern kingdom, fell. After a brutal siege, its gates were breached, its leaders captured, its treasures looted. What followed was not merely defeat, but erasure. The Assyrian policy of conquest was to uproot, to destroy not only kingdoms, but identities. Tens of thousands of Israelites were deported, men, women, and children marched away from their vineyards and homes to distant lands in Mesopotamia and Media. In their place, foreign peoples were resettled, creating a patchwork of tongues and beliefs, a land no longer Israel in anything but name. These exiles became known in Jewish tradition as the 10 Lost Tribes. Their fate was a wound in the national memory, a question whispered across centuries: where did they go? Were they scattered beyond the mountains, over the rivers, into the mists of legend? Some claim they founded new kingdoms in distant lands. Others believe they wandered forever, waiting to return. But no definitive trace of them was ever found. They became both real and mythic, symbols of loss, of judgment, and of a promise once broken. What remained was Judah, the smaller, southern kingdom, centered around Jerusalem and the Temple. Judah watched its sibling kingdom fall with dread and sorrow. Prophets like Isaiah spoke of Assyria as the rod of divine anger, an instrument to chasten but not to utterly destroy. He warned Judah not to follow in Israel's footsteps, not to trust in alliances or idols, but to return to covenant and justice. Assyrian records, carved in stone and written in Akkadian, boast of these campaigns. Reliefs from Sargon's palace show conquered peoples, chains at their feet, their eyes hollow with fear. One monument, the Black Obelisk, even depicts an Israelite king, Jehu, bowing before an Assyrian monarch. The Bible and archaeology, for once, speak in harmony, telling a tale of pride, rebellion, and the crushing power of empire. But the story of the lost tribes is not just about conquest. It is about identity, memory, and the fragile line between presence and oblivion. The people of Judah carried that memory like a stone in the shoe, painful, persistent, and impossible to ignore. The idea that a people, chosen and blessed, could vanish without a trace was both terrifying and galvanizing. So they wrote. They remembered. They shaped the story of Israel not just as a historical account, but as a warning, a lament, a promise that those who forget the covenant may be forgotten by history itself. And yet, the tribes were never entirely lost. Their legacy lived on in the prayers of their cousins, in the genealogies whispered around campfires, in the stories told to children about a time when all of Israel was one. The Assyrians could scatter bodies, but not entirely erase names. And for every exile, there remained a seed of return, not always in flesh, but in hope. Now, with Israel shattered, the eyes of history turned southward, to Jerusalem. Judah's time would come too. But for now, it stood alone, smaller, but still burning with the faith that had once united 12 tribes under one God. Part 7, Babylonian Exile and Judah's Fall. The hills of Judah once echoed with the sounds of worship and commerce, of priests in white linen tending sacred fires, of scribes hunched over scrolls in the shadows of stone buildings, of shepherds returning to the city gates at dusk. Jerusalem, the heart of the southern kingdom, stood resilient even as Israel to the north had crumbled under the weight of empire. For a time, it seemed Judah had learned the lesson of her sister's fall. But empires rise like storms, and the Assyrians who once scattered the 10 tribes gave way to an even greater force, the Babylonians. Under Nebuchadnezzar II, Babylon became not just a kingdom but a consuming fire. Where Assyria had been brutal, Babylon was methodical. Where Assyria uprooted, Babylon absorbed. And Judah, small and divided, sat in the shadow of its ambition. The final days of Judah were marked by political turmoil and desperation. Kings came and went in quick succession, often installed or deposed by foreign powers. Jehoiakim rebelled and paid for it in blood. Zedekiah tried diplomacy, then defiance, then regret. But nothing could stop what had already begun. In 586 BCE, Jerusalem fell. Not just its walls or its armies, but its soul. The Babylonians breached the gates after a long and punishing siege. Starvation had already weakened the defenders, plague had crept through the alleys, hope had withered like vines in a drought. And when the invaders entered, they did not merely conquer, they humiliated. The temple, once thought to be the very dwelling place of God, was set ablaze. Its treasures were looted. Its priests were slaughtered or enslaved. The Ark of the Covenant, that ancient symbol of divine presence, vanished from history. What had been sacred was now ashes. Thousands were taken in chains to Babylon, including the elite, princes, scribes, craftsmen, and prophets. They marched eastward across the deserts, away from the land of their ancestors, toward a city of ziggurats and strange gods. For many, it felt as though their covenant had ended. Their God, silent. Their temple, gone. Their identity, shattered. And yet, exile did not destroy them. It redefined them. In Babylon, the people of Judah became something new, Jews. No longer tied solely to a temple or a king, they turned inward, to texts, to memory, to ritual. The Torah, once preserved by priests and scrolls hidden deep within Jerusalem's chambers, became a lifeline. Scribes gathered in redacted traditions, preserving laws and stories not just for survival, but for meaning. The Sabbath became a temple in time. The synagogue, a space for prayer and study, emerged as a new kind of sanctuary. It was in exile that monotheism took firmer root. Without land or altar, the idea of a God not bound by place or nation grew stronger. A God who was with them in Babylon as he had been in Jerusalem. A God who could not be conquered or burned or silenced. The prophet Ezekiel saw visions beside the rivers of Babylon, of wheels within wheels, of dry bones rising, of a temple restored not in stone, but in spirit. Jeremiah, the weeping prophet, had warned of destruction but also spoke of a new covenant, written not on tablets but on hearts. These were not empty words. They were seeds planted in exile, watered by sorrow, blooming in memory. The Babylonians believed they had ended a people. But in truth, they had forged something more enduring than thrones or temples. They had pushed a nation to remember, to write, to imagine. And in the dusty alleys of Babylon, in quiet corners where prayers rose like smoke, the future of Judaism began to take shape. When the Jews finally returned decades later, allowed by a new empire and a new king, they carried with them not just hope, but resilience. They were no longer just the people of Judah. They were the people of the book. The people of exile. The people who had lost everything, and still remembered. Part 8, Return from Exile and Persian Rule. The streets of Babylon never truly became home, no matter how many years passed. The rivers, wider than those of Judah, reflected unfamiliar stars. The language that filled the markets was not their mother tongue. And though some exiles prospered, became merchants, scribes, and advisors to kings, the longing never left them. It settled into lullabies, into the rhythms of prayer, into the bones of old men who still faced west when they whispered the name of Jerusalem. Then, something unthinkable happened. Babylon fell. Not in flame or chaos, but with quiet efficiency. In 539 BCE, the armies of Cyrus the Great, king of Persia, entered the city without bloodshed. The Babylonian Empire, which had once seemed invincible, was now a prize beneath Persian banners. But Cyrus was not merely a conqueror. He was a different kind of king, one who believed in ruling through tolerance, not terror. Soon after taking Babylon, he issued a decree that rippled through the exile communities: the Jews could go home. To those who had never known anything but Babylon, the news brought confusion. To the elders who still remembered Jerusalem's stones, it brought tears. And for a people who had measured time by sorrow, it marked the beginning of something astonishing: return. Cyrus's edict, recorded in the biblical book of Ezra and echoed in the famous Cyrus Cylinder, allowed the exiles not only to return but to rebuild the temple. It was a political act, yes, meant to earn loyalty and ensure stability. But to the Jews, it felt divine. Isaiah had even called Cyrus God's anointed, a title never before given to a foreign king. The journey back was not easy. The land they returned to was not the Judah they remembered. Fields had gone fallow. The cities were half-ruined. Foreigners now tilled the soil. And Jerusalem, once the beating heart of their faith, was little more than rubble and memory. But they came anyway, by the thousands. Led by Zerubbabel, a descendant of King David, and the high priest Joshua, the first waves of returnees set about restoring what had been lost. They laid the foundation of a new temple, not as grand as Solomon's, but sacred nonetheless. When the foundation was laid, old men who had seen the former glory wept aloud. Their tears mingled with the shouts of joy from the young, who saw not loss, but rebirth. The Persian Empire, sprawling and efficient, governed through satraps and local rulers. For the Jews, this meant a delicate balance between autonomy and imperial oversight. They were allowed their laws, their festivals, their temple. But they were also subjects of a larger machine, answering to governors, paying taxes, and navigating the expectations of kings who ruled from distant capitals. It was during this time that the roots of the Jewish diaspora deepened. Not all exiles returned. Many chose to remain in Babylon, where they had homes, trades, and children. They established thriving communities, kept their customs, and became a vital part of Jewish life far beyond the borders of Judah. From this dispersion, a dual identity began to form, Jews of the land, and Jews of the world. Under Persian rule, Judaism evolved. Without a king, the high priest and the elders of the community took on greater authority. Without prophets thundering in the streets, the scribes and teachers began to shape the faith through study and preservation. This was the age when the written word became the anchor of belief, when oral traditions crystallized into scripture, and when memory became law. The return from exile was not a triumphant parade, but a slow, fragile rebuilding. The people carried wounds, physical, spiritual, generational. But they also carried something more enduring, hope. And in the quiet of their rebuilt city, under the shadow of the new temple, they began again. Not as the proud kingdom they once were, but as survivors. As students of loss. As keepers of covenant. In the great arc of history, they were no longer merely subjects of kings. They were becoming something far more powerful, authors of a story that would outlast empires. Part 9, Hellenistic and Hasmonean periods. The world changed again, as it always did, on the boots of a conqueror. This time, it was a young man from the distant hills of Macedonia, Alexander the Great, who swept through Persia like fire through dry grass. His armies, trained and tireless, crushed the once mighty Persian Empire in the 4th century BCE, and with it came something even more enduring than military conquest, Hellenism. Greek thought, language, art, and philosophy flowed across the lands Alexander had stitched into an empire. From Egypt to India, temples were rebuilt as gymnasiums, and oracles were replaced by rational debate. The world became smaller, interconnected by roads, coinage, and culture. For the Jewish people living in Judah and throughout the diaspora, this was a new kind of challenge, not of swords, but of identity. After Alexander's sudden death, his empire fractured. Judah found itself under the rule of the Seleucid Empire, one of the many fragments of his legacy. At first, the Seleucid kings allowed a measure of religious autonomy. Greek cities rose near Jewish villages, but the two worlds coexisted, if uneasily. Over time, however, pressure grew. Some Jews adopted Greek dress, studied Aristotle, and even had their sons undergo gymnasium training, which required painful physical alteration to erase signs of circumcision. Others saw this as betrayal, an erosion of the covenant, the beginning of forgetting. The tension exploded under the rule of Antiochus IV Epiphanes, a Seleucid monarch determined to Hellenize his realm by force. He forbade Jewish practices, desecrated the temple by dedicating it to Zeus, and imposed capital punishment for circumcision or Torah study. It was not just oppression, it was an erasure of sacred identity. But Judah had not forgotten how to resist. In the hill country of Judea, a priest named Mattathias struck the first blow. He refused to offer pagan sacrifices and killed the official who demanded it. With his sons, he fled into the wilderness, sparking a revolt that would become legendary. When Mattathias died, his son Judah, called Maccabee, the Hammer, took command. What followed was a guerrilla war of grit and faith. The Maccabees, vastly outnumbered, harassed Seleucid forces with ambushes and surprise attacks. They knew the land intimately and fought not just with swords, but with belief. They recaptured Jerusalem, cleansed the defiled temple, and rededicated it in a moment still remembered today, Hanukkah, the festival of lights. For the first time in centuries, the Jews were free. The Hasmonean dynasty, descendants of the Maccabees, established a sovereign Jewish kingdom. It was a triumph, but it came with complications. The Hasmoneans were priests, not kings, yet they claimed both titles. They expanded the territory, enforced Jewish law, and even forcibly converted neighboring peoples. Some Jews questioned their legitimacy. Others embraced their strength. The kingdom stood as a beacon of independence, but it was not without cracks. Hellenistic influences continued to swirl around the court. Internal divisions between religious factions, Pharisees, Sadducees, Essenes, grew sharper. And beyond the borders, a new power stirred in the west, one that watched the eastern lands with calculating eyes. Still, in this brief window of self-rule, Jewish culture flourished. Hebrew was revived. The temple stood proudly again. Pilgrims ascended to Jerusalem, songs rising with the smoke of offerings. Children learned the stories of David and Moses, not in fear but in freedom. For a time, it seemed the dream had returned. Yet history is a cycle of rise and fall, of light and shadow. The Hasmonean era would not last. But its spirit, the stubborn refusal to surrender identity, the belief that holiness could resist empire, would echo far beyond its final days. It would prepare the people for what came next, the might of Rome and the trials that would define a nation's soul. Part 10, Roman Conquest and Herod's Rule. By the 1st century before the Common Era, the independence won by the Maccabees had begun to unravel. The Hasmonean kingdom, once a symbol of Jewish resilience, had splintered into rival factions, each claiming authority, each suspicious of the other. Civil war raged not only between political leaders but within the very heart of Judean society. And in that chaos, Rome found its opportunity. The Roman Republic, expanding relentlessly eastward, entered the region as a mediator, but with every intention of staying. In 63 BCE, the Roman general Pompey marched into Jerusalem, not as a liberator, but as a conqueror. The temple was stormed. Thousands died. The inner sanctum, the Holy of Holies, was entered by foreign boots, an unthinkable desecration. Though the altar was spared, the city fell under Roman control, and with it, Judean sovereignty dissolved. Judea was now a client kingdom of Rome, subject to Roman governors and tribute. The dream of independence became a memory again, folded quietly into prayer and tradition. But Rome did not govern all lands directly, it preferred to install local rulers who would keep peace and collect taxes. And so entered one of the most controversial figures in Jewish history, Herod the Great. Herod was not of pure Jewish lineage, his family were Idumeans, converts to Judaism, but he was cunning, ambitious, and fiercely loyal to Rome. The Roman Senate appointed him king in 40 BCE, and after several years of military struggle, he secured control over Judea. Though he ruled with Roman backing, he presented himself as a defender of Jewish tradition. And in some ways, he was. Herod undertook building projects on a scale unseen since the time of Solomon. His crowning achievement was the expansion of the Second Temple, turning it into a wonder of the ancient world. The Temple Mount was flattened and broadened. White stone gleamed under the sun. Pilgrims from across the region came to behold its magnificence, and for a moment, it seemed that Jerusalem had regained its former glory. But Herod's reign was also marked by paranoia and cruelty. He executed his own wife, Miriam, and several of his sons, driven by fears of betrayal. The air around his court was thick with suspicion, and dissent was crushed with brutal efficiency. Though he kept the peace with Rome, he was never fully embraced by the Jewish people. To the common folk, he was a puppet of foreign power, a king without David's heart. Under Herod's rule, the cultural fabric of Judea continued to fray. Hellenistic cities grew in the countryside. Roman soldiers marched through marketplaces. Taxes were heavy, and resentment simmered just below the surface. Meanwhile, religious sects deepened their divisions. The Pharisees emphasized law and oral tradition. The Sadducees clung to priestly authority. The Essenes retreated into the desert, seeking purity away from corruption. And the Zealots plotted rebellion in whispers and shadows. Despite this unrest, the temple remained a unifying symbol, a place where rich and poor alike came to offer sacrifices, to pray, and to remember who they were. But the memory of freedom was still alive, and the promise of redemption, of a Messiah who would restore the kingdom, began to stir more urgently in the hearts of many. Herod died in 4 BCE, his kingdom divided among his sons and ruled under the watchful eyes of Rome. His death did not bring peace. If anything, it marked the beginning of a darker, more volatile era. The tensions he had suppressed with grandeur and fear would soon boil over into open revolt. But before that storm broke, there was a moment, however brief, when the temple stood tall against the blue sky, and Jerusalem hummed with life and pilgrimage. It was a city of contradictions, sacred and subjugated, grand and restless. And beneath its streets, the fault lines of history trembled, waiting to be shaken once more by war, prophecy, and fire. Part 11, Jewish-Roman Wars and Destruction. The uneasy calm that lingered after Herod's death was an illusion. Judea, under direct Roman rule and governed by often brutal prefects like Pontius Pilate, became a powder keg of religious fervor and political oppression. Taxes drained the lifeblood of the land, Roman symbols desecrated sacred spaces, and Jewish identity, already strained, began to splinter. The people seethed under the weight of foreign occupation, and from among them rose voices that no longer called for patience or prayer, but for war. In 66 CE, Judea exploded. What began as a protest against Roman greed soon cascaded into a full-blown rebellion. Zealots seized Jerusalem, drove out the Roman garrison, and declared independence. For the first time in over a century, the Jewish people had reclaimed their city. But the triumph was short-lived. Rome answered with fire and fury. General Vespasian and, later, his son Titus led legions into the land, methodically crushing each pocket of resistance. Galilee fell. Then Jericho. And finally, in 70 CE, Jerusalem itself was encircled. The siege was brutal. Starvation gnawed at the defenders. Factions within the city turned on each other. And when the walls were finally breached, Roman soldiers poured into the sacred city with unrelenting vengeance. The temple, the heart of Jewish worship, rebuilt and adorned by Herod, was set ablaze. Flames licked the heavens. Its golden ornaments melted and pooled between stone cracks. Survivors were slaughtered or enslaved. The city was razed. The Second Temple was no more. Yet still, resistance flickered. A final stand took place at Masada, where Jewish rebels and their families held out in a desert fortress. When Roman forces broke through, they found silence. Nearly 1,000 had chosen death over surrender. Their story would echo for centuries, a symbol of defiance and despair. The last gasp came with the Bar Kokhba revolt, 132 to 136 CE, an uprising fueled by the hope of messianic redemption. Led by the charismatic Simon Bar Kokhba, Jews again challenged Rome's might. For a brief moment, they won back territory and declared sovereignty. But Rome, now an empire with sharpened claws, responded ruthlessly. Entire towns were flattened. Hundreds of thousands perished. Judea was renamed Syria-Palestina in an effort to erase its Jewish heritage. Jerusalem was rebuilt as a Roman colony, Aliyah Capitolina, with Jews forbidden to enter. Yet Rome could not burn the memory. Part 12, Jewish Life in the Diaspora. After the dust of war settled and the temple lay in ruins, the Jewish people faced a new question: how to be a nation without a land. The answer came slowly, not in swords or stone, but in scrolls and stories. In Babylon, Alexandria, and further still, Jewish communities began to reimagine what it meant to belong. No longer tethered to a central sanctuary, their faith migrated to the mind, to the home, and to the synagogue. The Torah, once read aloud in temple courts, became the axis of a new kind of spiritual life. Rabbis emerged as leaders, teachers rather than priests, guiding their people not with sacrifices, but with study and interpretation. The Talmud, a sprawling compilation of laws, ethics, and debate, took shape over generations. It became a portable homeland, a living archive of identity that could not be conquered or burned. In Babylon, the Jewish academies flourished. In Egypt, Jews thrived in commerce and scholarship. In Spain, Rome, and later the Rhine Valley, they adapted, contributed, and endured. Through exile and distance, they remained tethered by ritual, by Sabbath candles, Passover meals, and whispered prayers facing Jerusalem. But the diaspora was not without pain. Pogroms, ghettos, forced conversions, these would scar the centuries to come. Anti-Jewish sentiment, born from ignorance and fear, would follow them across empires. And yet, the Jewish people did not vanish. They translated texts, wrote poetry, discovered medicine, and debated the divine with a ferocity unmatched. They were exiles, but not broken. From each new home, they carried the memory of Zion, of Jerusalem, of a land promised and lost. They taught their children, next year in Jerusalem. Not always in hope of return, but in affirmation of identity. The temple was gone. The kingdom was ashes. But the nation lived on, not in soil, but in spirit. And that spirit would one day rise again, carried by the same memory that had outlived Babylon, Rome, and time itself. Part 13, Islamic Rule in Jewish Communities. The rise of Islam in the 7th century swept across the ancient world like a desert storm, reshaping empires, languages, and lives in its wake. From the Arabian Peninsula, armies and ideas surged northward, and by the time the caliphs reached Jerusalem, the Byzantine hold over the region had crumbled. A new faith now claimed the sacred soil of the Holy Land, and with it came new rulers, and new rhythms of life, for the Jews who still clung to their ancestral land and those scattered across the diaspora. In 638 CE, the Rashidun Caliph Umar ibn al-Khattab entered Jerusalem. According to tradition, he arrived humbly, dressed in simple garments, riding not a war horse, but a camel. He visited the Temple Mount, not to build a palace or plunder, but to pray. Soon after, the Dome of the Rock would rise upon the site, its golden dome catching the sun like a beacon. Not far off, the Al-Aqsa Mosque would join it, making Jerusalem one of Islam's most sacred cities. But for the Jews, this new chapter was not one of conquest, but of cautious opportunity. Unlike under Roman and later Byzantine rule, where Jewish practice had been restricted and exile enforced, the early Islamic rulers permitted Jews to return to Jerusalem. A trickle of families, merchants, and scholars came back to the city, setting down roots where once they had been forbidden even to tread. Under the system of Dhimma, Jews were recognized as people of the book, followers of a monotheistic scripture, and were allowed to practice their religion in relative peace. In exchange, they paid a special tax and accepted second-class status in the Islamic order. It was not equality, but it was protection. And in many places, it was stability. Throughout the expanding Islamic world, from Baghdad to Cairo, from Cordoba to Jerusalem, Jewish life began to flourish in new and unexpected ways. Arabic became the shared tongue of trade and scholarship. Jewish thinkers translated Greek philosophy into Arabic, studied alongside Muslim theologians, and offered their own insights into the nature of reason and revelation. In the golden streets of Baghdad, under the Abbasid caliphs, Jewish academies thrived. The Talmud was studied with new vigor, commentaries multiplied, and a renaissance of learning stirred in the yeshivas of Sura and Pumbedita. Jewish merchants sailed the Indian Ocean and crossed the Sahara. Jewish poets wrote in Arabic meters. Jewish physicians served in royal courts. And yet, the picture was not universally golden. There were caliphs who were tolerant, and there were caliphs who were cruel. There were cities where Jews lived as neighbors, and others where they were confined to ghettos. Periods of cultural brilliance were interrupted by episodes of persecution, forced conversions, and violence. In 11th century Granada, a mob incited by anti-Jewish sentiment stormed the palace and massacred hundreds. In parts of Yemen and Persia, humiliation and hardship replaced acceptance. But through all of it, Jewish communities adapted. They learned the art of survival, not just physically, but spiritually. The liturgy evolved to reflect exile and hope. Stories were preserved, histories written, letters exchanged between far-flung communities from Spain to the Levant. the Jewish people remained dispersed, but increasingly interconnected. In the Holy Land, the Jewish population remained small but persistent. Pilgrims visited the graves of prophets and sages. Small communities in cities like Tiberias, Safed, and Hebron kept the flame of tradition alive. Jerusalem, though ruled by Muslim powers, remained a touchstone of prayer and prophecy. Perhaps the most remarkable feature of Jewish life under Islam was its paradox, both flourishing and fragile. In the courts of caliphs, Jews were trusted advisors, translators, financiers. In the back alleys of cities, they lived humbly, always aware that their status depended on the whims of rulers and the tides of public opinion. One day welcomed, the next accused. Still, for centuries, the Islamic world was a vital chapter in the Jewish story, a place where culture and commentary bloomed, and where, despite the limitations of their status, Jews carved out a space to endure and even thrive. As the stars rose over Jerusalem, their light filtered through three traditions: Jewish, Christian, and Muslim. And while power shifted and dynasties rose and fell, the Jewish people remained, scattered yet connected, always drawn to the memory of Zion. In the centuries to come, the tides would turn again. But the echoes of Jewish voices under Islam, both hopeful and haunted, would leave a lasting mark, written not in conquest or crowns, but in scrolls, poems, and prayers. Part 14: Crusades and Medieval Struggles. The Holy Land, ever sacred, had never truly known peace. But in the late 11th century, a storm approached from the west, carried on banners marked with crimson crosses, mounted on horses armored with zeal. It was the age of the Crusades, and for the Jews of the Levant and Europe alike, it was to be an era of blood, fire, and fear. In 1095, Pope Urban II stood before a crowd in Clermont and called for Christian knights to reclaim Jerusalem from Muslim hands. His words ignited a fury that swept across Europe, fusing faith with sword. But as the Crusaders marched eastward, they did not wait for the Holy Land to wage their holy war. In towns like Worms, Mainz, and Speyer, centers of thriving Jewish life, pogroms erupted. Entire communities were slaughtered by mobs who saw the Jews as infidels in their midst. The First Crusade was already soaked in Jewish blood long before it reached the walls of Jerusalem. In 1099, when the Crusaders breached Jerusalem's defenses, they unleashed an apocalyptic fury. The city's Muslim and Jewish inhabitants were massacred indiscriminately. The streets reportedly ran red with blood. The Jews of Jerusalem, who had gathered in their synagogue to pray, were burned alive inside it. The city that had once symbolized divine promise now bore the charred scars of human cruelty. For nearly a century, the Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem ruled the Holy Land. Under their rule, Jewish life in the city was nearly extinguished. What communities remained lived quietly, scattered in other parts of the region: Acre, Tiberias, and further north. Trade resumed, but tension lingered. Pilgrims still came, though their prayers were often whispered with caution. And yet, amid the darkness, there flickered unexpected hope. In 1187, Saladin, the Kurdish Muslim general and sultan, retook Jerusalem after defeating the Crusaders at the Battle of Hattin. His victory was swift and decisive, but his mercy was even more enduring. Unlike the bloodbath of 1099, Saladin allowed for a peaceful surrender. He opened the gates to Jews once again. After centuries of exile, Jewish families returned to Jerusalem, carrying with them sacred scrolls and centuries of longing. For the first time in hundreds of years, Jewish prayer echoed once more in the city of David. In the years that followed, under Ayyubid and later Mamluk rule, Jewish communities began to rebuild slowly. Tiberias was resettled, and in Safed, high in the Galilean hills, a mystical renaissance would one day bloom. Though Jews remained a minority and their status always uncertain, they found moments of quiet to gather, to study, and to remember. But the broader medieval world offered little sanctuary. In Christian Europe, the legacy of the Crusades was one of deepening suspicion and intolerance. Jews were expelled from England in 1290, from France in 1306, and from Spain in 1492. Accused of poisoning wells, of desecrating hosts, of causing plagues, Jews lived at the mercy of monarchs and mobs. The ghetto became a common feature of European cities. Walls did not only encircle them physically but symbolically too, separating Jewish life from the Christian world. Still, inside those walls, Jewish culture persisted. Songs were sung. Candles lit. Children taught to read and recite. The Torah remained their homeland in exile. In the Ottoman Empire, which conquered the Levant in 1517, a new chapter began. The Ottomans, though not without prejudice, were more tolerant than many of their Christian contemporaries. Jews fleeing persecution in Europe found refuge in cities like Salonika, Istanbul, and even Jerusalem. Ottoman sultans welcomed Jewish physicians, advisors, and merchants into their courts. And in the Holy Land, Jewish communities, though poor and small, began to stir with life once more. By the end of the medieval period, the Jewish people had survived war, exile, crusade, and expulsion. The scars were deep and the trauma vast, but so too was the endurance. Through every hardship, they carried with them a scroll, a prayer, a memory. They remained tethered not to walls or kingdoms, but to the idea of a promised land, a hope passed from parent to child, whispered across oceans, etched into the Sabbath Psalms. The Holy Land, and especially Jerusalem, was never far from the Jewish heart, even when their feet were thousands of miles away. They did not forget the city of their ancestors. And when others built walls, they built memory. In the centuries to come, that memory would awaken again. But for now, the Jewish people endured, survivors of crusades, keepers of a quiet flame. Part 15, Rise of Zionism in the 19th Century. By the 19th century, the Jewish people had spent nearly 2 millennia in exile. From the bustling ghettos of Venice to the silent shtetls of Eastern Europe, they had lived as a people apart, at home in no nation, welcomed in few, and often reviled in many. Yet in prayer and poetry, the dream of returning to Zion, to Jerusalem, never vanished. It echoed in daily blessings, in Sabbath songs, and in whispered hopes passed through generations. And as the modern world began to stir with revolutions and reform, that ancient dream began to take shape once more, not as a prayer, but as a political movement. The 19th century was a time of enormous transformation. Empires shook, borders shifted, and the Enlightenment brought with it the promise of new freedoms. In Western Europe, Jews began to emerge from centuries of marginalization. In France, Germany, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, many gained civil rights and entered universities, professions, and politics. For a moment, it seemed as though exile might end, not through return to the land of Israel, but through assimilation into the modern world. But elsewhere, especially in Eastern Europe and Russia, the darkness remained. Pogroms, violent anti-Jewish riots, raged through Jewish towns in Ukraine and Poland. Homes were burned, synagogues desecrated, women assaulted, and lives lost. The promises of equality and safety proved hollow. In Russia, Jews were confined to the Pale of Settlement, restricted in movement, and targeted with suspicion. The blood libel, accusations that Jews murdered Christian children, resurfaced with terrifying regularity. In this climate of fear and rising nationalism, a new idea began to take root: perhaps the Jewish people could never truly belong in the lands of others. Perhaps exile could not be ended by assimilation. Perhaps they needed a homeland, not only as a refuge from persecution, but as a place where Jewish culture, language, and life could flourish freely and openly. This was the seed of Zionism. The term Zionism would not be coined until later, but the stirrings began earlier. Jewish intellectuals and rabbis began to advocate for a return to Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel, not as a religious aspiration alone, but as a national one. Writers like Moses Hess, in his work Rome and Jerusalem, argued that Jews were a people with a shared history, language, and destiny. Small groups of idealists began to form, dreaming of building new communities in the ancestral homeland. Then came Theodor Herzl. An assimilated Austrian journalist and playwright, Herzl had once believed in the promise of integration. But in 1894, he stood in a Parisian crowd and watched as French citizens screamed "Death to the Jews," during the Dreyfus Affair, a political scandal in which a Jewish army officer was falsely accused of treason. Herzl saw that even in the heart of Enlightenment Europe, anti-Semitism remained a powerful force. In response, he wrote Der Judenstaat, the Jewish State, a visionary manifesto that called for the establishment of a sovereign Jewish homeland. He argued not from religious sentiment, but from political necessity. Jews, he claimed, were a people like any other and deserved a nation of their own. Herzl's words struck a chord. In 1897, he organized the first Zionist Congress in Basel, Switzerland. Delegates from across Europe, secular and religious, socialist and capitalist, gathered under one banner. Together, they declared that Zionism seeks to establish a home for the Jewish people in Palestine secured under public law. Yet even among Jews, Zionism was controversial. Some Orthodox leaders opposed it, believing that only the Messiah could bring about a return to the land. Others feared it would divide Jewish efforts for equality in their current homelands. And many secular Jews, particularly in Western Europe and America, felt no desire to leave the nations they had come to call home. Despite these tensions, the movement grew. Hebrew, long confined to prayer books, was revived as a living language. Young Jews began preparing to emigrate to Ottoman Palestine, not as tourists or pilgrims, but as pioneers. They dreamed of farming the land, building new towns, and forging a society rooted in both ancient memory and modern ideals. The dream of Zion was no longer just an echo from exile. It had become a political vision, a cultural revival, and for many, an urgent necessity. As the 20th century approached, the foundations of a monumental transformation had been laid. A people long scattered and scorned were now organizing to return, not merely to a patch of earth, but to a future they had long imagined. The road ahead would not be easy. But the idea had taken root. Zion, once only a symbol of longing, was becoming a destination. Part 16, First Aliyah and Early Jewish Settlement. In the waning years of the 19th century, long before the World Wars or the creation of modern Israel, a quiet and determined wave of Jewish pioneers set their sights on the distant hills and plains of Ottoman-controlled Palestine. Their journey was not marked by fanfare or military might, but by plows, seed bags, and a fierce belief in a future rooted in ancient soil. This was the first Aliyah, a movement of return that was as much spiritual as it was physical, and as much a struggle as it was a dream. Between 1881 and 1903, spurred by violent pogroms in the Russian Empire and growing anti-Semitism across Eastern Europe, thousands of Jews, mainly young, idealistic, and deeply connected to the land in their imaginations, left behind their homes in Ukraine, Poland, Romania, and beyond. They were not wealthy, nor were they experienced farmers. Many came from small towns where life had been lived behind synagogue walls, with ink-stained fingers turning sacred pages. But now, they were heading toward a land they had only known in prayer, toward Zion. The journey to Palestine was long and uncertain. Ships carried them across the Mediterranean, and the first sight of the coast, often Jaffa's low-lying harbor, filled them with awe and trepidation. The land was beautiful, sun-scorched, and brimming with history, but it was not easy. Much of it was swampy and mosquito-ridden, with infertile soil and scarce water. The local Ottoman authorities viewed the newcomers with suspicion. Local Arab communities, who had tilled this land for centuries, watched their arrival with growing concern, unsure of their intentions. These early pioneers called themselves Halutzim, the vanguard, the trailblazers. They saw themselves as fulfilling the biblical call to rebuild Zion, but with their own hands, their own sweat. Many of them settled in places like Petah Tikva, Rishon LeZion, Zikron Yaakov, and Rosh Pina, names that would later become etched into the Israeli landscape. They built stone homes where there had been tents, planted vineyards where weeds had once grown, and slowly carved out a new kind of life, part Old Testament, part modern nationalism. But it was not easy. Malaria was rampant in the coastal lowlands. Tools were scarce. Agricultural knowledge was limited. The Ottomans placed restrictions on land purchases and Jewish immigration, often requiring bribes or complex legal maneuvering. Some settlers gave up and returned to Europe. Others died from disease or exhaustion. The dream of return was quickly tempered by the reality of survival. Still, they persisted. To support the struggling communities, Wealthy Jewish philanthropists, most notably Baron Edmond de Rothschild of France, stepped in. Rothschild funded agricultural schools, sent agronomists from Europe, and helped turn failing farms into productive vineyards and citrus orchards. While some settlers bristled at his top-down control, his assistance helped many settlements survive their most fragile years. Culturally, the First Aliyah was transformative. It marked one of the first large-scale revivals of Hebrew not just as a liturgical language, but as a spoken, everyday tongue. In schools and homes, children began to speak Hebrew as their first language, something that had not happened in centuries. The land of the Bible was once again filled with the sounds of the biblical language, reimagined for a new age. Yet tension simmered beneath the surface. Land purchases, often made from absentee landlords, resulted in the displacement of local Arab tenant farmers, leading to early friction between Jewish settlers and Arab villagers. While some relationships were cooperative, based on trade and mutual respect, others were marked by distrust, resentment, and occasional violence. The seeds of a larger conflict were being sown, even in these early, hopeful days. But for the settlers of the First Aliyah, these challenges did not outweigh the vision. They saw themselves as builders of a national rebirth. Each tree planted was a declaration. Each furrow plowed was a prayer. They were returning not only to a place, but to an identity long fractured by exile and diaspora. By the time the First Aliyah drew to a close in the early 20th century, its impact was unmistakable. Though small in number, roughly 25,000 immigrants, it had laid the groundwork for a new Jewish presence in the land. Towns stood where none had stood before. Hebrew had begun to live again. And an idea once confined to synagogues and Congress halls had taken root in the soil itself. The land was awakening, and so were its people. The dream of a homeland was no longer just a prophecy, it was becoming a place you could walk, touch, and call your own. Part 17, Second Aliyah and Socialist Zionism. As the dawn of the 20th century broke over Europe, another wave of Jewish immigrants began to flow into the land of Palestine. This time, the newcomers were younger, bolder, and burning with revolutionary fire. Unlike the First Aliyah's religious traditionalists and bourgeois settlers, the pioneers of the Second Aliyah were steeped in the ideals of socialism, secularism, and self-liberation. Between 1904 and 1914, roughly 35,000 Jews arrived in Ottoman Palestine, most of them from the Russian Empire, carrying with them not only meager belongings but a fierce determination to remake the world, and themselves. They came in the shadow of trauma. The pogroms following the failed Russian Revolution of 1905 left entire Jewish communities shattered. The Pale of Settlement had become a trap. Universities barred their entry, police tracked their movements, and mobs attacked them with impunity. But where their parents had once prayed for deliverance, these new immigrants, many barely out of adolescence, believed in action. They had been shaped by underground reading circles, workers' protests, and the dream of creating a new Jewish identity, one forged not in exile, but through labor, land, and collective life. When they landed in Palestine, they found a land both ancient and indifferent. The stones of Jerusalem did not weep for their suffering. The fields did not till themselves. Much of the land was owned by absentee landlords, and like the First Aliyah before them, they encountered swamps, disease, and hostility from both the Ottoman authorities and some local Arab communities. Yet their response was not despair, but defiance. If the land was hard, then they would become harder still. They called themselves halutzim, pioneers, but in spirit, they were builders of a revolution. Many joined or founded kvutzot, the precursors to kibbutzim, collective farms where everything was shared: labor, food, childcare, and ideology. Life in the kvutzah was raw and often miserable. There was rarely enough to eat. The summer heat scorched their backs. In winter, cold winds howled through makeshift shelters. But they endured, and through that endurance, they created something entirely new, a model of communal life driven by egalitarian ideals and a rejection of the old diaspora way of life. Central to this new identity was the labor movement. The Second Aliyah gave birth to Pole Zion, Workers of Zion, and later Histadrut, the powerful labor federation that would shape the future of the Yishuv, the Jewish community in Palestine, for decades. These movements believed that Jewish dignity could only be reclaimed by Jewish hands working Jewish soil. No more middlemen, no more scholars in exile, they would become shepherds, builders, and farmers. They sang in Hebrew, danced around bonfires, and dreamed of building a just society in the land their ancestors had only longed for. But for all their idealism, the second Aliyah pioneers also sowed seeds of conflict. They rejected the employment of Arab laborers, insisting on a voda ivrit, Hebrew labor, as both a principle and a necessity for national rebirth. While this gave many Jews meaningful work, it also deepened economic and social divisions with the local Arab population. The land, once shared by necessity, began to fracture along ethnic lines. The rift would widen in the years to come. Culturally, however, this era was one of extraordinary creativity. One of its most iconic figures was David Ben-Gurion, who arrived in 1906 and would later become Israel's first prime minister. Another was Golda Meir, a young woman inspired by socialist ideals who would eventually rise to lead the nation. Writers like Yosef Chaim Brenner and Rachel the poetess gave voice to the emotional turmoil of this generation, caught between Old World pain and New World aspiration. And there was Tel Aviv. Founded in 1909 on sand dunes north of Jaffa, it began as a cooperative housing project of 66 Jewish families. There were no trees, no roads, only a vision of a modern Hebrew-speaking city, free from the constraints of history. It was a small step, but symbolically enormous, the birth of a city from the dust, a new Jerusalem made of concrete and dreams. Then came the storm. In 1914, the First World War swept across Europe, drawing the Ottoman Empire into its chaos. Immigration ceased. Settlements were abandoned. The second Aliyah came to an abrupt halt, but its legacy endured. It had laid the cultural and ideological foundations for a new society. It had planted the seeds of the Hebrew revival, collective living, and Jewish self-determination. Though small in number, the pioneers of the second Aliyah had transformed Zionism from an idea into a living, breathing struggle. They had begun to craft a new Jewish identity, rooted not in exile, but in the land itself. And in that soil, watered by hardship and hope, the future was quietly beginning to grow. Part 18, the Balfour Declaration and British Mandate. In the autumn of 1917, as the First World War dragged across continents and empires tottered on the edge of collapse, a single letter changed the course of Middle Eastern history. It was short, just over 100 words, but its consequences would ripple across decades, shaping identities, igniting passions, and laying the groundwork for a storm that has yet to fully subside. This was the Balfour Declaration, a missive from the British Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour to Lord Rothschild, a prominent figure in the British Jewish community. In it, the British government declared its support for the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. To the Zionist movement, it was a triumph. For years, Jewish leaders like Chaim Weizmann had lobbied Britain, arguing that Jewish self-determination in the ancestral homeland aligned with British strategic interests. Weizmann, a chemist by trade and diplomat by temperament, had skillfully built alliances across British high society. His scientific contributions during the war, most notably a synthetic process for producing acetone, had earned him both access and respect. Now, after decades of yearning and lobbying, the Jewish cause had received the endorsement of one of the world's greatest imperial powers. But behind the celebratory tone of the declaration, ambiguity and contradiction lurked. The same letter that promised a home for the Jews also insisted that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine. Given that Arabs comprised over 90% of Palestine's population at the time, many would come to see the document not as a bridge to peace, but as a blueprint for conflict. When British troops captured Jerusalem later that year, the land of Palestine passed from the declining Ottoman Empire into the hands of the British Empire. A few years later, in 1920, the League of Nations formally granted Britain the mandate for Palestine, tasking it with governing the territory and implementing the promise of the Balfour Declaration. On paper, it seemed simple enough. In reality, the British found themselves guardians of two competing national dreams. To the Jewish immigrants who began arriving in larger numbers, especially from Eastern Europe, the British mandate offered opportunity. Hebrew schools and institutions flourished. The city of Tel Aviv began to spread its white-walled wings along the Mediterranean coast. The Histadrut organized labor, and the Jewish agencies served as a proto-government. Each arrival brought more hands to build and more hearts determined to reclaim a future denied in the ghettos of Europe. To the Arab inhabitants of Palestine, however, British rule increasingly felt like betrayal. Many had been led to believe that, in return for support during the war against the Ottomans, the British would support Arab independence. Instead, they saw more Jewish settlements, more land purchases, and a British administration that appeared, in their eyes, to favor the Zionist cause. Frustration turned to resistance. Riots broke out in Jerusalem in 1920, then Jaffa in 1921, and again across the country in 1929. The British found themselves torn. On the one hand, they had made a promise to the Jewish people. On the other, they governed a land where the Arab majority grew increasingly angry. Commissions were formed, reports were written, policies shifted like desert sands. Immigration quotas were adjusted, then readjusted. Land laws were passed to slow Jewish acquisition. Yet nothing could halt the deeper currents pulling the region toward confrontation. During this period, British officials walked a tightrope, balancing diplomacy with disillusionment. In Whitehall, policy was debated in corridors thick with imperial ambition and bureaucratic fog. On the streets of Jerusalem and Haifa, trust in British neutrality eroded. To the Jews, Britain had become a reluctant gatekeeper. To the Arabs, it was a collaborator in dispossession. Yet despite the growing tensions, the Mandate years saw foundational developments. Hebrew became a national language. Universities were established. Political parties formed. Infrastructure expanded. Jewish defense organizations like the Haganah took root, preparing for a day when defense would no longer be the responsibility of an imperial power. Meanwhile, Palestinian Arabs organized strikes, protests, and nationalist movements of their own, asserting their right to the land they called home. By the late 1930s, the British Mandate was straining under the weight of irreconcilable expectations. The Jewish people, traumatized by growing anti-Semitism in Europe and barred from many other lands, saw Palestine as their only refuge. The Arab population, fearing permanent loss of their land and political power, began to resist with mounting force. The Balfour Declaration had opened a door, but it did so without knowing who might be waiting on either side. Under the British Mandate, the land of Palestine became not just a place, but a question, one that the coming decades would ask again and again: who belongs here? And who decides? The answers would be written in hope, in sorrow, and in struggle, and the ink had only just begun to flow. Part 19, The Holocaust and its Impact. It began with whispers, laws quietly passed, windows broken, jobs lost. Then came the badges, the ghettos, the trains. For the Jewish people of Europe, the 1930s were not just a descent into darkness, but a collapse of the very idea that assimilation or loyalty could guarantee safety. In city after city, in towns they had lived in for generations, centuries of life were erased in mere months. The Holocaust, the Shoah, was not merely a tragedy, it was a rupture so profound that it transformed the Jewish experience forever. And for the Zionist movement, it made the argument for a Jewish homeland not one of hope, but of survival. By the end of World War II, 6 million Jews had been murdered. Children, grandparents, artists, doctors, workers, all gone. Entire communities vanished as if they had never existed. Names became ashes. For those who survived, the world felt cold and foreign. Displaced persons camps dotted post-war Europe, filled with dazed survivors who had nowhere to go and no one left to return to. Homes had been looted. Neighbors had betrayed them. Borders had shifted. In many places, anti-Semitism still festered in the rubble of liberation. For the Zionists, this horror was both a vindication and a wound. Since the late 19th century, they had warned that Jews could never be truly safe in the diaspora. Now, the Shoah stood as unbearable proof. Palestine was no longer just a spiritual yearning or nationalist ideal, it was, for many, the only imaginable refuge. And yet, even as survivors pleaded to reach its shores, the gates remained closed. During the war, Britain had issued the White Paper of 1939, sharply limiting Jewish immigration to Palestine in an attempt to appease growing Arab opposition. These restrictions remained in force, even after the camps were liberated. For Holocaust survivors, the irony was cruel. After surviving the ovens and the bullets, they were denied the right to begin again. Ships were turned away, or worse, like the Exodus 1947, a vessel carrying over 4,500 refugees, were intercepted by the British and forcibly returned to Europe, some even to German soil. Photographs of emaciated survivors being dragged off boats stirred outrage across the globe. In response, Jewish resistance intensified. Underground militias like the Irgun and the Haganah organized not only immigration efforts but acts of sabotage against British infrastructure. Explosions rocked railway stations. Posters denounced British policy. A war within a war was unfolding, one between a weary empire trying to manage its retreat and a stateless people desperate to claim their future. Global opinion began to shift. In the United States, in Britain, and at the fledgling United Nations, the horrors of the Holocaust stirred moral reckoning. The image of the Jew had changed, from an outsider to a victim, from a people with no land to a people with nowhere to turn. Sympathy translated into support, especially in the United States, where President Truman began urging the British to allow greater Jewish immigration into Palestine. Even as political debates raged, the basic truth grew harder to ignore. After the Holocaust, the Jewish people needed a homeland. But the Holocaust's impact was not just political, it was deeply psychological. Among Zionists, it introduced urgency, even desperation. Among the wider Jewish world, it ended many illusions about life in exile. European Jewry had been the cultural and intellectual heart of the Jewish world. Now, it was a graveyard. That vacuum would be filled, in part, by the community in Palestine, known as the Yishuv, which had survived the war relatively unscathed. The Yishuv had no gas chambers, no ghettos. It had fields, schools, farms, and an army. It began to look not just like the future of the Jewish people, but perhaps its only future. In the displaced persons camps, children were taught Hebrew. Adults joined training programs to prepare for life in Palestine, farming, defense, education. Zionist emissaries traveled from tent to tent, organizing transports and sharing news from the homeland. Songs once sung in Warsaw were now sung in Haifa. Slowly, painfully, a shattered people began to gather its fragments. The Holocaust did not create Zionism. But it forged an unbreakable bond between Jewish suffering and the necessity of statehood. It silenced many critics, hardened many believers, and convinced even some skeptics that never again could Jews depend on others for safety. Palestine became not a place of longing, it became destiny. And as the British mandate frayed, as the world tried to recover from its own wounds, the momentum behind Jewish statehood surged forward, not just propelled by politics, but by grief, memory, and the promise that the dead would not be forgotten. The land waited. And in the hearts of the survivors, hope and history burned like twin candles against the night. Part 20, the 1947 UN Partition Plan. By the mid-1940s, the British mandate in Palestine had become an untenable pressure cooker. Decades of conflict, two traumatized communities, and the moral weight of the Holocaust had left Britain exhausted and desperate to hand off the problem. Riots, bombings, political paralysis, this small sliver of land had become too volatile, too costly, and too complex for an empire in retreat. In early 1947, Britain turned to the newly formed United Nations with a simple request: solve the Palestine question. The result was one of the most ambitious, controversial, and consequential diplomatic proposals of the 20th century, the UN Partition Plan. Officially known as UN General Assembly Resolution 181, the plan was bold in scope and delicate in balance. It proposed the end of British rule and the division of Palestine into two separate states, one Jewish, one Arab. Jerusalem, too sacred to be claimed by either side, was to be placed under international administration, a city shared in theory, if not in spirit. The proposed map was a patchwork of territories, like a jigsaw puzzle with jagged edges. the Jewish state was to occupy about 55% of the land, much of it in the Negev desert, while the Arab state would claim about 45%, including the fertile Central Hill country and parts of the coastal plain. The arrangement was based not only on population distribution but also on economic interdependence, trade routes, and access to ports. For the Zionist leadership, the plan was far from perfect, but it was good enough. It provided international legitimacy for Jewish sovereignty and a tangible path to statehood. David Ben-Gurion and other leaders of the Jewish Agency accepted it, even though many privately mourned the loss of Jerusalem and the fragmentation of the territory. They saw it not as an endpoint, but as a beginning, a foothold, a chance, an acknowledgement after centuries of statelessness. The Arab world, by contrast, rejected the plan outright. To Arab leaders and the Palestinian Arab population, the partition was an unjust reward for what they saw as colonial intrusion and land appropriation. How could a minority group, composed largely of recent immigrants, be handed the majority of the land? What of the hundreds of thousands of Arabs living in the proposed Jewish areas? To many, the plan was a betrayal, a continuation of imperialism under a new name. On November 29, 1947, the General Assembly gathered in Lake Success, New York. Delegates cast their votes one by one. 33 voted in favor, 13 against, and 10 abstained. When the result was announced, Jewish communities around the world erupted in joy. In Tel Aviv, crowds danced in the streets. Strangers embraced. Old men wept. The dream of a Jewish state, long deferred, had taken a decisive step toward reality. But the joy was shadowed by the storm already gathering. Even before the ink had dried on the resolution, violence broke out in Palestine. Arab militias attacked Jewish convoys and settlements, Jewish paramilitaries retaliated. What began as communal clashes escalated into open civil war. British forces, still technically the governing authority, largely stood by, counting the days until their withdrawal. In the months that followed, fear gripped both communities. Arab villagers fled advancing Jewish forces, often uncertain whether rumors of massacres were real or propaganda. Jewish neighborhoods endured shelling and sniper fire. The lines between defense and aggression blurred. The partition, designed to separate, instead ignited a desperate battle for every hilltop, every village, every road. Internationally, the plan sparked fierce debate. Some supported the UN's attempt to resolve an impossible problem. Others decried it as a violation of self-determination for the Arab majority. Yet amidst the global rhetoric, the facts on the ground moved faster than diplomacy. Armies were being trained. Borders were being drawn with bullets. For the Jews of Palestine, the partition vote felt like a promise. For the Arabs, it was a provocation. And for the British, it was a countdown. On May 14, 1948, the mandate would end. What came next, war, peace, or something in between, would be determined not in the halls of the United Nations, but in the dust and shadows of the land itself. The partition plan may have aimed to solve the conflict, but instead, it marked the beginning of a new and bloodier chapter, one whose echoes continue to shape lives and politics to this day. Part 21, Israel's Declaration of Independence. The tension in the room was palpable. Outside, in the streets of Tel Aviv, rumors swirled and nerves frayed. British rule was ending in mere hours. War was not just a possibility, it was expected. Arab armies were massing across borders. Inside the old art museum on Rothschild Boulevard, Jewish leaders gathered around a simple table draped in white. There were no grand palaces, no trumpets. Just men and women who had lived through exile, persecution, and war, now preparing to declare the rebirth of a nation. It was Friday, May 14, 1948. As the final hours of the British mandate ticked away, David Ben-Gurion rose to speak. The room quieted, and the weight of history settled on the shoulders of everyone present. Before him sat members of the Jewish People's Council, flanked by a portrait of Theodor Herzl, the father of modern political Zionism. A small radio stood ready to broadcast the words that would echo around the world. Ben-Gurion's voice was steady but restrained, as if he too could scarcely believe the moment had arrived. He read from a carefully crafted scroll, "We hereby proclaim the establishment of the Jewish state in Eretz Israel, to be known as the State of Israel." He spoke of the ancient connection between the Jewish people and the land, of their forced exile and their unwavering hope. He invoked both historical right and international recognition, referencing the Balfour Declaration and the UN Partition Plan. The declaration promised equality to all inhabitants, regardless of religion, race, or gender, a vision as aspirational as it was necessary. When he finished, the room erupted, not in wild cheers, but in solemn applause. The past and future had converged in that moment. After 2,000 years of wandering, persecution, and yearning, the Jewish people once again had a sovereign homeland. Just 11 minutes later, the United States, under President Harry Truman, became the first nation to recognize the new state. The Soviet Union would follow shortly after. But recognition was not the only thing that came swiftly. Within hours, 5 Arab nations, Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq, launched a military invasion. The Declaration of Independence had, in an instant, transformed a civil war into a regional conflict. This was not a war of flags and ceremonies. It was house-to-house fighting, desperate defenses of settlements, and hastily trained units rushing to hold fragile lines. For the new state of Israel, it was a battle for survival. Its population was outnumbered and outgunned. Its army, the Haganah, had barely unified its factions. The state had no air force to speak of, no tanks, and limited supplies. And yet, within weeks, the tide began to turn. The Israelis fought with a mixture of desperation and resolve. Holocaust survivors, some still bearing tattooed numbers on their arms, now stood guard over kibbutzim in the Galilee or manned outposts in the Negev. Women served as medics, couriers, and fighters. Makeshift factories churned out bullets and rifles. International volunteers, Jews and non-Jews alike, came to defend the fledgling nation. And against all odds, the state endured. But the cost was profound. As Israel secured its borders, more than 700,000 Palestinians fled or were expelled from their homes in what they would call the Nakba, the catastrophe. Some left fearing war, others were forced out. Villages emptied. Refugees streamed across borders into neighboring Arab countries. The creation of Israel, a triumph for Jews worldwide, became a defining trauma for Palestinians, a wound that has not healed to this day. Within months, armistice agreements were signed. Israel had not only survived, it had gained more territory than the UN partition plan had granted. The West Bank was annexed by Jordan. Gaza fell under Egyptian control. Jerusalem was divided between Israeli and Jordanian rule. The lines drawn in 1949 would remain for nearly 2 decades, shaping the region's fragile balance. Back in Tel Aviv, the fledgling state got to work. There were immigrants to absorb, institutions to build, a military to formalize, and an economy to stabilize. The ideals laid out in the Declaration of Independence, democracy, equality, and cultural renewal, would face immediate and enduring tests. But for the moment, they had done what generations had only dreamed of: re-establish a Jewish state in the land of Israel. The flag that was raised that day, white with 2 blue stripes and a Star of David, fluttered not just as a symbol of a nation, but as a defiant banner of survival, revival, and hope. The world had changed. And nothing, from that day forward, would be the same in the Middle East. Part 22, the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. The day after Israel's declaration of independence, the skies above Tel Aviv thundered, not with celebration, but with warplanes. Egyptian bombers dropped their payloads over the city as tanks rolled in from the south, while Jordanian, Syrian, Lebanese, and Iraqi forces advanced from other directions. The newborn state, less than a day old, was at war with 5 surrounding nations. Its survival now hinged on hastily armed militias, undertrained recruits, and the sheer will of a people determined not to be cast out again. It became known as the War of Independence in Israel, and the Nakba, or catastrophe, in the Arab world. The fighting was not a single front but a patchwork of simultaneous battles. Villages turned into strongholds. Roads were lifelines. Jerusalem, sacred and contested, became a crucible of siege and sniper fire. The first phase was grim. Arab armies, equipped with British and French weapons, had superior firepower and formal command structures. The Jewish forces, fragmented between groups like the Haganah, Irgun, and Lehi, struggled to coordinate. Ammunition was scarce. Artillery was almost non-existent. In some places, fighters had no uniforms, only armbands and homemade explosives. But the tide began to shift. The Jewish forces unified under a central command, forming what would soon be known as the Israel Defense Forces, IDF. Foreign volunteers, many of them World War II veterans, brought experience and daring. Smuggled weapons from Czechoslovakia and elsewhere began to arrive. Slowly, inch by inch, the Israelis began to push back. In the north, the Galilee was secured. In the south, the Negev was defended against Egyptian armor. The most brutal fighting occurred in and around Jerusalem, where Jewish convoys braved sniper fire and ambushes to bring food and water to the besieged western half of the city. Some convoys never made it. The dead lined the roads. Meanwhile, as battles raged, another, quieter movement began, the flight of Palestinian Arabs. Some left voluntarily, fearing war and chaos. Others were forcibly expelled. Many were caught in the middle, driven from their homes by violence, rumors of massacres, or the fear of being labeled enemy collaborators. Entire villages emptied overnight. Key Arab cities like Haifa and Jaffa saw panicked evacuations. In total, over 700,000 Palestinians became refugees, scattered across the Arab world, their homes and orchards left behind. By early 1949, after months of attrition, Israel had survived. Not only had it defended its borders, but it had expanded them. Territories granted to the Arab state under the UN partition plan were now under Israeli control. The West Bank was annexed by Jordan, and Gaza was administered by Egypt. No Arab state for Palestinians emerged from the war. A series of armistice agreements were signed, temporary lines, not recognized borders. These green lines would remain the de facto boundaries of Israel until 1967. The Arab states, humiliated by their failure to defeat the new Jewish state, refused to recognize Israel's existence. For Israel, the war was both a victory and a warning. Independence had been earned, but it would never be secure without vigilance. The cost was staggering. Over 6,000 Jews, nearly 1% of Israel's population, were killed. Thousands more were wounded. Arab casualties were even higher. Cities bore the scars of artillery. Cemeteries filled with the young. And across the region, both Jewish and Arab communities were changed forever. For the Arab world, the war deepened resentment and radicalized new generations. Palestinian refugees, barred from returning to their homes, settled in makeshift camps in Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, and Gaza, camps that would become permanent fixtures of the region. Their plight, and the memory of lost villages, would become rallying cries for decades to come. For Israel, the war forged a national identity rooted in resilience. The IDF became not just a military, but a unifying institution. Statehood, once a dream, was now a fact, etched into reality through sacrifice and survival. Yet peace remained elusive. The conflict hadn't ended, it had merely evolved. The 1948 Arab-Israeli War marked the birth of Israel in blood and fire. But it also marked the beginning of the modern Middle East conflict, a tangled web of nationalism, displacement, and unhealed wounds that would echo through generations. The war had redrawn borders, shifted populations, and rewritten futures. And it left one truth standing amidst the smoke: the question of Israel and Palestine would not fade quietly into history. It would demand reckoning. Again and again. Part 23, Early Statehood and Jewish Immigration. The war had barely ended when the ships began to arrive. They came crowded with weary souls, survivors of the Holocaust, refugees from Arab lands, people who had known only flight, hiding, and hunger. Some wore the striped uniforms of concentration camps beneath donated coats. Others carried nothing but a name written on paper and hope etched deep into their eyes. They came from the ruins of Europe and the ancient quarters of Baghdad, from the Atlas Mountains and the Dnipro River. And they came to a country not yet ready for them, a land of dusty roads, makeshift tents, and dreams pressed into urgency. The new state of Israel, scarcely a year old, was already facing one of its greatest challenges, absorbing an unprecedented wave of immigration. Between 1948 and 1951, more than 700,000 Jews poured into the country, doubling the population in just 3 years. The newcomers were met with open arms, but also limited resources. There were not enough houses, not enough food, not enough jobs. The government scrambled to build transit camps, known as ma'abarat, where families lived in tin shacks or canvas tents, waiting for something better. For many, that wait lasted years. And yet, amidst the hardship, something extraordinary began to happen. A society was being built, not just out of bricks and ration cards, but out of stories, songs, and shared determination. Children born in Iraq now played side by side with those from Poland. Hebrew, once only a language of prayer and poetry, became the common tongue on playgrounds and in classrooms. The state invested in education, healthcare, and basic infrastructure. Everyone was expected to contribute, to shoulder the burden of nation building. Integration, however, was not without tension. Jews from Europe, the Ashkenazim, had dominated the leadership of the Zionist movement and held most of the government positions. Jews from Arab and North African countries, the Mizrahim, often found themselves marginalized, directed into development towns on the periphery, expected to adapt to a culture that did not always reflect their own. They brought with them rich traditions, music, cuisine, and spirituality, but were often treated as second-class citizens in their new homeland. Meanwhile, Israel's economy teetered under the weight of demand. Food and fuel were rationed. The government issued austerity cards, limiting how much bread, sugar, or meat each family could buy. Foreign aid, particularly from American Jews, helped, but it wasn't enough. Still, factories opened, universities expanded, and new towns rose from scrub and sand. People planted trees as acts of defiance, turning dry hills green, one sapling at a time. Politically, the state was forging its identity. David Ben-Gurion led a coalition government under the Labor Zionist banner. The Knesset, Israel's parliament, began to shape laws and policies that would define the character of the state. Debates were fierce, from the role of religion to the rights of Arab citizens who had remained within Israel after the war. The state promised equality, but reality lagged behind. Military rule was imposed on many Arab villages, curfews enforced, and land appropriated in the name of security and development. Yet, despite hardship and complexity, there was a sense of momentum. People believed in the project. They built it with their hands, defended it with their bodies, and debated it passionately in cafes and public squares. Holocaust survivors became teachers, bus drivers, soldiers. Immigrants from Yemen brought Torah scrolls wrapped in white cloth across desert sands. Entire communities, once scattered across continents, were beginning to root themselves in the land of Israel. By the mid-1950s, the ma'abarat had begun to shrink, replaced by permanent housing and new neighborhoods. Children who had arrived speaking Ladino or Arabic were now fluent in Hebrew. A national culture, diverse, contentious, vibrant, was taking shape. Israel was no longer just a declaration or a wartime miracle. It was a living, breathing country. Still scarred, still striving, but undeniably alive. And every family, whether from Krakow or Casablanca, had added its thread to the tapestry. A tapestry woven through resilience, identity, and the profound belief that even after centuries of exile and suffering, a people could gather, rebuild, and begin again. In the dusty winds of the desert and the coastal breeze of Haifa, a new chapter was being written, not by generals or prophets, but by ordinary people with extraordinary endurance. Their stories were quiet, but together they formed the heartbeat of a nation. Part 24, The Suez Crisis of 1956. The summer of 1956 was hot, even by desert standards, but the winds carried more than just heat. They carried tension, political, military, and deeply personal. In Egypt, President Gamal Abdel Nasser stood before cheering crowds and declared the nationalization of the Suez Canal, a move aimed at freeing Egypt from colonial control and funding the construction of the Aswan Dam. To many in the Arab world, Nasser was a symbol of strength and independence. To Israel, France, and Britain, he had just lit a match at the edge of a powder keg. The Suez Canal, carved through Egyptian sands and long controlled by European powers, was more than a waterway, it was a lifeline for global trade and a symbol of empire. Its nationalization sparked outrage in London and Paris, where diplomats plotted in smoky rooms and warships were quietly moved into position. But for Israel, the stakes were different. The tiny state had lived under siege since its birth, and Nasser's Egypt had become the loudest voice calling for its destruction. Egyptian forces had blockaded the Straits of Tiran, cutting off Israeli shipping routes to the Red Sea. Fedayeen, militant Arab fighters, had been crossing from Egyptian-controlled Gaza into southern Israel, attacking civilians and sowing fear. War, it seemed, was inevitable. Behind closed doors, Israel, Britain, and France formed a secret plan. Israel would invade Egypt's Sinai Peninsula, and in response, Britain and France would intervene, calling for a ceasefire and seizing control of the canal under the guise of peacekeeping. It was a diplomatic shell game, meant to restore Western control and punish Nasser's boldness. On October 29, 1956, Israel launched Operation Kadesh. Israeli paratroopers dropped into the Sinai, landing near key mountain passes. Ground forces pushed forward swiftly, covering vast desert terrain in days. They overran Egyptian positions, captured military installations, and approached the Suez Canal with stunning speed. Soldiers fought through blinding sandstorms, slept in trenches beneath moonless skies, and advanced in the shadows of long-dormant pyramids. For Israel, it was a show of capability, a lightning campaign proving its army was not only defensive but strategically agile. Britain and France followed the script, issuing ultimatums and then launching airstrikes under the pretense of separating the warring sides. But the world was no longer in the grip of colonial powers. The United States, under President Eisenhower, was furious at being left in the dark. The Soviet Union, already eyeing trouble in Hungary, threatened retaliation. International condemnation mounted quickly, and the carefully staged performance unraveled. In the end, military victories could not outweigh diplomatic losses. Under pressure from both the US and the UN, Britain, France, and Israel were forced to withdraw. Israel did so reluctantly, extracting a promise that its shipping routes through the Straits of Tiran would be reopened and that a UN peacekeeping force would be stationed in Sinai to prevent future hostilities. But the promise would be tested again, and soon. The Suez Crisis was a paradox for Israel. On one hand, it demonstrated the effectiveness of its armed forces and its willingness to act independently in defending its interests. On the other hand, it revealed the limits of military power in a world increasingly governed by superpower politics and international pressure. It showed that even the boldest actions could be checked by global opinion, and that alliances, even secret ones, came with a price. Domestically, Israelis were left with mixed feelings. There was pride in the army's performance, but also frustration at the forced retreat. In cafes and newspapers, people debated whether the operation had been worth it. Soldiers returned to their homes with stories of victory, but also the knowledge that their country remained fragile, surrounded by enemies and subject to the whims of greater powers. For Egypt, the crisis was a public relations triumph. Though Nasser had lost the battlefield, he emerged as a hero across the Arab world, a man who had stood up to the old empires and survived. For Britain and France, the crisis marked the twilight of their colonial influence. And for Israel, it was another lesson in the dangerous calculus of survival, one that would shape its military doctrine and foreign policy for decades to come. In the dusty silence after the guns fell quiet, the Sinai returned to its ancient stillness. But beneath the surface, new currents were stirring. The next storm would not be far behind. Part 25, The Six-Day War, 1967. The tension before the storm was almost unbearable. In the spring of 1967, the air in Israel was thick with uncertainty and dread. Radio stations played patriotic songs between urgent news bulletins. Reservists kissed their children goodbye and reported to duty. In cafes and homes, people whispered about war, not as a possibility, but as a certainty. For weeks, the region had been on edge. Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser had expelled the UN peacekeeping forces from the Sinai Peninsula and sent tens of thousands of troops to the border. He had closed the Straits of Tiran once again, effectively blockading Israel's southern port of Eilat, a move seen as an act of war. Syria and Jordan joined in military posturing, and Arab leaders declared their intent to destroy Israel. Israeli leaders feared encirclement. They feared annihilation. And yet, in that pressure cooker of fear, Israel made its move. On the morning of June 5, 1967, in a preemptive strike that would alter the course of Middle Eastern history, Israeli fighter jets roared across the skies toward Egypt. In a matter of hours, they destroyed nearly the entire Egyptian Air Force while it was still on the ground. It was a staggering blow, delivered with surgical precision and total surprise. Within days, Israel would fight on 3 fronts, against Egypt, Jordan, and Syria, and turn what had looked like a possible second Holocaust into a stunning, almost mythic, military victory. In the Sinai Desert, Israeli tanks raced through sandstorms and abandoned Egyptian camps, pushing deep toward the Suez Canal. Paratroopers, hardened and swift, captured key positions. In the north, they battled Syrian forces in the Golan Heights, steep, fortified hills that had long rained artillery down on Israeli farms below. And in the center, a battle was being waged for a city that had always been more than just geography, Jerusalem. The old city, with its winding alleys and ancient stones, had been under Jordanian control since 1948. For 19 years, Jews had been barred from the Western Wall, the holiest site in Judaism. Now, Israeli soldiers fought through streets scarred by centuries of conquest to reclaim it. On June 7, after fierce house-to-house combat, Israeli paratroopers reached the wall. Their commander, Madiger, radioed the words that echoed across a nation, "The Temple Mount is in our hands." For many Israelis, it was a moment that felt biblical, miraculous. Soldiers wept openly as they touched the massive stones. Some prayed. Some simply stood in silence, overwhelmed by history's weight. In synagogues and public squares, crowds broke into song. The heart of the Jewish people, long closed behind barbed wire and battle lines, was now open once more. By June 10, just 6 days after it had begun, the war was over. And the map of the Middle East had changed. Israel now controlled the Sinai Peninsula, Gaza Strip, West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Golan Heights. The small, vulnerable country had suddenly expanded to include territories brimming with strategic and symbolic significance. It was hailed as a defensive triumph, but it also opened new wounds that would fester for decades. With the West Bank came control over a large Palestinian population, and with it, the birth of an enduring occupation. The victory had secured Israel's borders in the short term, but also saddled it with a question that has haunted it ever since: what to do with the land and the people, now under its rule. International reactions were mixed. The United States saw a key ally emerge stronger. Arab states, humiliated and grieving, began to regroup and harden their positions. The Khartoum Resolution, issued later that year, famously declared no peace, no recognition, and no negotiations with Israel. Meanwhile, in Israel, a heady sense of triumph mingled with the burden of new responsibilities. The war had given Israel breathing space. It had shown the world that the Jewish state was not a fragile experiment but a determined, capable force. But it had also ushered in a new era, of territorial disputes, Palestinian disenfranchisement, and an international debate that has never truly ended. And so, in the quiet after the gunfire, Israeli flags flew over the wall, over Gaza's dunes, over the rocky slopes of the Golan. But peace, once again, remained elusive. The land had been won, but not yet the future. Part 26, the Yom Kippur War, 1973. It began with silence. On the afternoon of October 6, 1973, the streets of Israel were hushed. It was Yom Kippur, the holiest day of the Jewish year. Synagogues were filled with fasting worshippers. Radio broadcasts had gone quiet. the entire country seemed to pause in reflection. Then, without warning, that sacred stillness was shattered. From the north and the south, Egyptian and Syrian forces launched a surprise attack. Tens of thousands of soldiers surged across ceasefire lines, catching the Israeli defense forces unprepared. On the Golan Heights, Syrian tanks rolled over fortified positions, while in the Sinai Peninsula, Egyptian troops crossed the Suez Canal under cover of artillery, pushing deep into Israeli-held territory. For the first time since its founding, Israel appeared to be losing. The shock was total. Israeli intelligence had failed to predict the attack, convinced that Arab states would not dare strike. The country's political and military leaders scrambled to respond, but for the first 48 hours, the situation was dire. Reserve units were rushed into battle. Teenagers who had been fasting just hours before now found themselves loading rifles and boarding buses for the front. For many, it felt like the nation's very survival hung by a thread. In the Sinai, Egyptian forces moved swiftly. They brought with them portable bridges, surface-to-air missiles, and a new sense of discipline. Their early victories were not fleeting. They dug in and prepared for an extended confrontation. On the Golan Heights, Israeli defenders were vastly outnumbered, yet they held the line with grim determination, losing tanks and comrades by the hour but refusing to fall. As the days passed, Israel began to turn the tide. The IDF launched counteroffensives, first halting the advance, then pushing back. In the north, Israeli armor drove the Syrians out of the Golan and advanced toward Damascus. In the south, General Ariel Sharon, with his trademark boldness, led a daring maneuver across the Suez Canal, encircling the Egyptian Third Army. What had started as a stunning Arab offensive was now morphing into a precarious stalemate. Internationally, the war sent tremors across the globe. The United States airlifted military supplies to Israel, while the Soviet Union supported its Arab allies. The confrontation became a Cold War proxy battle. Meanwhile, Arab oil producers declared an oil embargo, punishing Western nations that supported Israel. Gasoline prices soared, and economies stumbled. The battlefield had expanded far beyond the Middle East. After nearly 3 weeks of fierce fighting, a UN-brokered ceasefire took hold on October 25, 1973. The borders had shifted only slightly, but everything else had changed. The Yom Kippur War left over 2,500 Israelis and over 15,000 Arab soldiers dead. It shattered Israeli confidence in its military invincibility. The pain of the losses ran deep. Soldiers returned home not to parades, but to funerals and hospital wards. The myth of the Six-Day War had faded into grief and reckoning. For the Arab world, the war was both a military defeat and a psychological victory. Egypt and Syria had shown they could challenge Israel. Their early successes restored pride after the humiliations of 1967. For Israel, the war was a reminder that it could never afford complacency. Intelligence systems were overhauled. Military doctrines were rewritten. Political leadership, particularly that of Prime Minister Golda Meir, came under harsh scrutiny. Yet out of the ashes of the Yom Kippur War came the first real flicker of peace. Egyptian President Anwar Sadat, emboldened by Egypt's early performance, began to speak of negotiation. Israel, sobered by its vulnerability, began to listen. The war, for all its pain, laid the foundation for a new dialogue, one that would, just a few years later, lead to the Camp David Accords. But that was still in the future. For now, in late 1973, the land was once again quiet. The Golan Heights stood bruised but held. The Sinai sands covered the remains of tanks and memories of fierce battles. And in Israeli homes, families lit memorial candles, not just for the dead, but for the lost certainty of a world they thought they understood. The Yom Kippur War had changed everything. It had shown that peace would not come easily, and that survival would always carry a cost. Part 27, The Camp David Accords, 1978 to 1979. The journey to peace began with a handshake that few believed possible. The backdrop was the crisp mountain air of Maryland, where the quiet retreat of Camp David stood hidden among pine trees. For 13 long days in September 1978, that wooded silence would become the setting for one of the most improbable diplomatic breakthroughs in modern history. The war had left its scars. Since the Yom Kippur War in 1973, Israel and Egypt had remained locked in a tense stalemate, separated by a fragile ceasefire and a deep well of distrust. But time had shifted perspectives. Anwar Sadat, the charismatic president of Egypt, had come to realize that endless conflict had brought his people little but grief and poverty. Across the border, Israeli Prime Minister Monarchy began, a man shaped by decades of struggle and survival, had begun to recognize that even hard-won victories could not guarantee lasting security. It was Sadat who made the first astonishing move. In November 1977, he stepped off a plane at Ben Gurion Airport, the first Arab leader to visit Israel. His speech in the Knesset, calling for peace, sent shockwaves through the Arab world. Many branded him a traitor. Others dared to hope. The gesture, bold and deeply symbolic, cracked open a door that had long seemed sealed shut. U.S. President Jimmy Carter, watching the moment unfold, saw an opportunity. He invited both leaders to Camp David, determined to guide them toward a permanent peace. But once the meetings began, optimism gave way to deadlock. Sadat and Begin were old warriors, proud, stubborn, and deeply suspicious. The history between their peoples was steeped in blood and betrayal. Initial talks dissolved into anger. At times, they refused even to sit in the same room. Yet Carter refused to let the opportunity slip away. Acting as mediator, he shuttled between the two men, crafting language, offering compromises, and invoking both reason and emotion. He brought photographs of Israeli and Egyptian children to the negotiating table, reminding the leaders of what was at stake. At one point, when the talks nearly collapsed, Carter wrote personal letters to Begin's grandchildren, appealing to the human cost of war. The Prime Minister, deeply moved, returned to the table. Piece by piece, a framework began to emerge. Egypt would recognize Israel's right to exist, an unprecedented step in the Arab world. In exchange, Israel would withdraw from the Sinai Peninsula, returning land that had been seized in the Six-Day War. Both nations agreed to establish diplomatic relations. Embassies would be opened. Flags would fly. Peace, once unthinkable, would be written into law. On March 26, 1979, under the spring sun in Washington, D.C., Sadat and Begin signed the Egypt-Israel Peace Treaty, with Carter standing between them. Cameras flashed. Hands shook. The world watched, stunned. A war-torn corner of the Middle East had chosen dialogue over destruction. For their efforts, Sadat and Begin were jointly awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. But the price of peace was steep. Sadat returned to Egypt to a nation divided. Many praised him, but others seethed with fury. To them, Camp David was a betrayal of the broader Arab cause, especially the Palestinian struggle. In 1981, during a military parade in Cairo, Sadat was assassinated by extremists within his own army. His death sent a chilling reminder of how dangerous the pursuit of peace could be. In Israel, the response was also mixed. While many embraced the treaty, others viewed the withdrawal from Sinai as a painful concession. Settlers were uprooted. Strategic outposts were abandoned. Begin, once the symbol of hardline resistance, had taken a step that few imagined he would. His legacy, too, became a matter of debate. Yet despite the costs, the Camp David Accords endured. Egypt and Israel remained at peace, even as other conflicts flared. The treaty reshaped the geopolitical map. It demonstrated that diplomacy could succeed, even in a region often defined by bitterness and bloodshed. Years later, the paths that led to Camp David would be studied by diplomats, historians, and peacemakers around the world. But perhaps its deepest truth lay in the courage of two enemies who, for a fleeting moment, saw beyond war and dared to imagine another way. Part 28, The First Lebanon War, 1982. The summer of 1982 began with tension thick in the air, like a storm waiting to break. Israel, still reeling from years of cross-border attacks, looked northward, to Lebanon, a nation fractured by civil war and overflowing with foreign fighters. There, the Palestine Liberation Organization, PLO, had entrenched itself in the chaos, launching rockets and raids into northern Israeli towns. The northern border had become a place of fear and funerals. Then, a spark, an assassination attempt on Israel's ambassador in London, was the final match tossed into the dry grass. On June 6, 1982, Israel launched Operation Peace for Galilee. The goal, at least publicly, was limited, to push PLO forces 40 kilometers north of the Israeli border, far enough to stop the attacks. But the mission quickly expanded. Within days, Israeli tanks were not just moving into southern Lebanon, they were advancing all the way to Beirut. Streets once filled with merchants and families now echoed with the clatter of tank treads and the whistle of incoming shells. Israeli forces battled their way through towns and hillsides, facing fierce resistance not just from PLO fighters, but from an increasingly tangled web of Syrian forces, Shiite militias, and Lebanese factions. The war was no longer a simple mission, it had become a multi-sided conflict inside a country already torn at the seams. Urban warfare consumed cities like Tyre, Sidon, and eventually Beirut itself. Civilians were caught in the crossfire. The line between combatants and innocents blurred in the dust and smoke. In West Beirut, the siege dragged on for weeks. The Israeli army surrounded the city, bombarding PLO positions while trying to avoid mass civilian casualties, a near impossible balance. The world watched in horror as the bombs fell, apartment blocks crumbled, and families huddled in basements. Journalists reported from the front lines. Protests erupted in cities around the world. Within Israel, dissent was growing. Then came August, and with it, a temporary peace. A U.S. brokered agreement led by American diplomat Philip Habib saw Yasser Arafat and thousands of PLO fighters evacuated by sea to Tunisia. It was a dramatic moment, fighters boarding ships under the watchful eye of international peacekeepers, promising not to return. But the war was not over. In September 1982, tragedy struck. The Sabra and Shatila massacre, a horrifying event that would forever stain the memory of the war, unfolded when Falangist Christian militias, allies of Israel, entered Palestinian refugee camps in West Beirut. Over the course of several days, hundreds, possibly thousands, of civilians were slaughtered. Israeli forces, though not the perpetrators, had surrounded the camps and allowed the Phalangists in. They did nothing to stop the killing. The fallout was immediate and seismic. International condemnation rained down. Inside Israel, grief turned to outrage. Hundreds of thousands of Israelis marched in Tel Aviv demanding answers. The Kahan Commission, a government-appointed inquiry, found that Israeli officials, including Defense Minister Ariel Sharon, bore indirect responsibility. Sharon was forced to resign, though he would later return to politics in dramatic fashion. The First Lebanon War had changed Israel, and not in the way its architects had imagined. What had begun as a mission to secure the northern border had become an 18-year entanglement. Israeli soldiers remained in southern Lebanon until 2000, facing attacks from a new and dangerous force, Hezbollah, a Shiite militant group born out of the war and backed by Iran. For many Israelis, the war came to symbolize the limits of military power and the moral complexity of modern warfare. It was a war without clear victory, a campaign whose goals shifted with every passing week. Soldiers who had grown up hearing of the triumphs of 1948 and 1967 now returned home bearing the scars of a war with no heroes, only survivors. In Lebanon, the legacy was even darker. The war deepened sectarian divides, devastated cities, and added yet another chapter of suffering to a land already drowning in conflict. The First Lebanon War served as a painful reminder, not all battles can be won by force, and not every enemy has a face. Sometimes, the greatest wounds are those inflicted not by bullets, but by decisions made in the fog of ambition and fear. Part 29, The First Intifada, 1987 to 1993. It began not with a declaration of war, but with a funeral. In December 1987, a traffic accident in Gaza left 4 Palestinian laborers dead, struck by an Israeli military truck. To many, it seemed like a tragic but routine mishap. But years of frustration had already primed the land like a dry field before a fire. the deaths were a spark. That night, protests broke out. The next day, stones flew. And soon, across the West Bank and Gaza Strip, a storm gathered. The First Intifada had begun. For the first time in decades, the Israeli occupation of Palestinian territories, seized in the 1967 war, was not being challenged by organized armies or outside nations, but by the people living under its rule. This was a popular uprising, unarmed in the traditional sense, but no less potent. Young boys faced down tanks with slingshots. Women organized strikes and baked bread for protesters. Graffiti became a language of rebellion. Streets became battlegrounds of civil resistance and military control. The word intifada, Arabic for shaking off, captured the spirit of the movement. Palestinians were shaking off decades of control, curfews, checkpoints, and the daily indignities of life under occupation. But it was also a shaking of identity, a generation born after 1967 asserting its voice. Schools became flashpoints. Camps became symbols. Mosques became gathering places, and funerals became marches. Israel, unprepared for this kind of conflict, responded with a heavy hand. Soldiers, often young conscripts themselves, were thrust into the impossible role of peacekeepers, enforcers, and occupiers all at once. Rubber bullets gave way to live ammunition. Raids were conducted nightly. Entire neighborhoods were sealed off. The government's policy of breaking bones, a euphemism for physically punishing protesters, was condemned internationally. What was meant to restore order instead intensified the resistance. And yet, the uprising was not centrally orchestrated. It arose organically, then was nurtured by local leadership committees that coordinated boycotts, distributed underground newsletters, and kept the momentum alive. The Palestine Liberation Organization, PLO, exiled in Tunisia, was caught off guard. They had not started this. But as the months turned to years, they came to embrace it, and eventually represent it. The toll was immense. More than 1,000 Palestinians were killed, thousands more arrested or injured. On the Israeli side, over 100 soldiers and civilians lost their lives. The human cost was visible in hospitals and cemeteries, but also in the emotional weight carried by both communities. Parents grieved. Soldiers wept. Children grew up too fast. Internationally, the Intifada reshaped the conversation. The image of an armed soldier facing off against a boy with a stone captured headlines and shifted public opinion. Television cameras brought the conflict into living rooms around the world. The United States, long a close ally of Israel, began pushing harder for a diplomatic solution. Europe called for restraint and negotiations. Arab states, dealing with their own political pressures, issued cautious support for the Palestinians but offered little direct aid. Within Israel, the uprising sparked a reckoning. Movements like Peace Now gained traction. Military reservists refused to serve in the territories. Writers, artists, and intellectuals began to ask difficult questions. What kind of nation are we becoming? Can we continue to occupy another people without losing ourselves? By the early 1990s, the ground had shifted. Secret negotiations in Oslo, Norway began between Israeli and Palestinian representatives. For the first time, both sides sat across the table not as enemies, but as reluctant partners in a process few believed would work. The First Intifada had not won in a traditional sense, but it had changed the narrative. It forced the world to acknowledge the Palestinian people not just as refugees or radicals, but as a population demanding dignity, statehood, and a future. As the sun began to set on the First Intifada, the hopes of peace flickered on the horizon. But beneath the surface, wounds remained unhealed. The stones had spoken, but the land still trembled. Peace was not yet born. But the silence had been broken. Part 30. The Oslo Accords and Peace Efforts. It began in secret. Not in Washington or Cairo or any of the expected capitals of diplomacy, but in a quiet manor house tucked within the forests of Oslo, Norway. Far from cameras, far from press, far from the weight of history, two sworn enemies sat at the same table. For decades, the idea of the Palestine Liberation Organization, PLO, and the State of Israel negotiating peace had seemed as improbable as snow in the Negev. But in the early 1990s, something changed. The First Intifada had shaken both societies. Israel, battered by nightly unrest, began to realize that its military might could not extinguish a people's desire for sovereignty. The Palestinians, weary of funerals and curfews, recognized that stones and slogans alone would not bring a state. The PLO's exile leadership, under Yasser Arafat, saw an opportunity. In Israel, a new political reality was forming under Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, a general-turned-peacemaker who understood the costs of war all too well. Oslo was, in every sense, a gamble. The talks were back-channel, informal, almost improvised at first. Academics and aides began the conversation, finding common ground in phrases, in pauses, in humanity. Over time, senior officials replaced them, carrying the hopes and fears of millions. Trust was fragile. Every handshake felt like walking a tightrope stretched across generations of bloodshed. But progress came. By September 1993, a tentative agreement was ready, a framework, not a resolution. The Oslo I Accord did not create peace, but it promised a path toward it. It recognized the PLO as the legitimate representative of the Palestinian people and, for the first time, saw Israel and the PLO formally acknowledging one another's existence. It laid out plans for a phased withdrawal of Israeli forces from parts of the West Bank and Gaza, and for the creation of a Palestinian Authority to govern those areas. The world watched as Rabin, Arafat, and U.S. President Bill Clinton stood on the White House lawn. Cameras flashed. Hands were shaken. Words were spoken not in anger, but in hope. Enough of blood and tears, Rabin declared, his voice shaking with something deeper than nerves. For a brief moment, history paused. Peace seemed not only possible, but near. In the following months, the mood shifted. Israeli buses carried schoolchildren to Palestinian towns. Palestinian flags fluttered over Gaza. Checkpoints vanished, if only temporarily. Delegations exchanged flowers instead of fire. There were embraces in Ramallah, cautious smiles in Tel Aviv, and tearful reunions across a fractured land. But shadows lingered. For many Israelis, Arafat remained a figure of fear, a symbol of years of terror. For many Palestinians, Rabin and the Israeli government still represented occupation and checkpoints, even amid the talks. Extremists on both sides condemned Oslo as betrayal. Hamas, opposed to negotiations, carried out bombings inside Israel. Far-right Israeli voices grew louder, accusing Rabin of endangering the Jewish state. In 1995, those voices turned violent. On a cool November evening in Tel Aviv, at a peace rally filled with music and candles, Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated by an Israeli extremist. A gunshot ended not only a life, but an era. Rabin's death sent shockwaves through Israeli society. He had been a soldier, a father, a reluctant dreamer. His funeral drew leaders from across the globe, but at home, grief quickly turned to political turbulence. In the years that followed, the Oslo process stalled. New leaders brought different visions. Trust eroded. Violence returned. The Second Intifada would later erupt, fueled in part by the failures and unfulfilled promises of Oslo. Yet, even amid the setbacks, the Accords left a legacy, a recognition that dialogue, however fragile, was possible. Today, Oslo is remembered not just for what it achieved, but for what it represented. A moment when enemies sat together, not because they suddenly agreed, but because they dared to imagine a different future. The documents signed in Oslo were imperfect, the road they mapped unfinished. But they remain a testament to something rare in the long conflict over the land, a whisper of peace in a place accustomed to shouting. And in that whisper, even now, there echoes a question: if peace was possible once, could it be again? Part 31, The Second Intifada, 2000 to 2005. The silence didn't last. By the end of the 1990s, the optimism of Oslo had begun to unravel. Promises faded into footnotes. New checkpoints appeared where old ones had vanished. Settlements expanded, peace talks stalled, and trust withered under the weight of unmet expectations. For Palestinians, life under occupation had changed little despite years of negotiation. For Israelis, the fear of bombings and the disillusionment with a partner they had once embraced began to harden into something colder. Then came the spark. In September 2000, Ariel Sharon, then the head of Israel's opposition, visited the Temple Mount, or Haram al-Sharif, as it is known to Muslims. The site is holy to both Jews and Muslims, and Sharon's visit was viewed by many Palestinians as a provocation. Riots broke out. Clashes turned deadly. And what began as angry protests swelled into something much larger, much more violent. The Second Intifada, also called the Al-Aqsa Intifada, had begun. But this uprising was different from the first. Where the First Intifada had relied on stones and civil disobedience, the second was soaked in blood. Suicide bombings became a symbol of desperation and rage. Israeli buses, cafes, and markets were torn apart by explosions. Civilians, teenagers out for ice cream, families shopping for groceries, were reduced to headlines and heartbreak. In response, Israel launched intense military operations, re-entering areas it had previously withdrawn from, and clamping down with curfews, raids, and arrests. The cities of the West Bank became battlegrounds. Nablus, Jenin, Ramallah, names that once evoked olive trees and ancient stone now rang with gunfire. Israeli tanks rolled through refugee camps. Helicopters hovered above densely packed neighborhoods. Entire blocks were reduced to rubble in search of militants. But for every militant found, another child watched from a window, another teenager buried a sibling. And the cycle spun on. In March 2002, the violence reached a new peak. A Palestinian suicide bomber blew himself up at a Passover Seder in a hotel in Netanya, killing 30 civilians. The attack stunned Israel. In response, the Israeli military launched Operation Defensive Shield, the largest military campaign in the West Bank since 1967. Cities were placed under siege. Arafat's compound was surrounded. Dozens of Palestinians were killed. So were Israeli soldiers. Fear consumed both sides. To the outside world, the Second Intifada looked like a region collapsing. International mediators flew in and out with declarations and handshakes. Protests erupted across Europe and the Arab world. On television, images of grieving mothers, Israeli and Palestinian alike, blurred into one another, unified by sorrow. Inside Israel, the attacks shifted the political landscape. In 2001, Ariel Sharon became prime minister, promising security above all else. Trust in the peace process eroded. Within the Palestinian territories, chaos reigned. The Palestinian Authority, weakened and under siege, struggled to maintain control. Meanwhile, Hamas and Islamic Jihad gained strength by offering defiance in place of diplomacy. Out of this storm rose one of the most controversial symbols of the era, the Israeli West Bank barrier, a massive wall and fence system constructed to separate Israel from the West Bank. Supporters hailed it as a necessary defense against terrorism, pointing to the steep decline in suicide bombings after its construction. Critics called it a land grab, slicing through Palestinian communities, far beyond the Green Line. For many Palestinians, the wall was a physical manifestation of separation, of exclusion, of a future walled off before it could begin. By 2005, the violence had exhausted both sides. Thousands had died, over 3,000 Palestinians, and more than 1,000 Israelis. Arafat had died the year before, in a French hospital, his final days shrouded in mystery. In his place rose Mahmoud Abbas, a quieter, more diplomatic figure who opposed violence. Israel, too, was shifting. Ariel Sharon, once the general of sieges, now proposed something unthinkable a few years before: withdrawal from Gaza. The Second Intifada ended not with a treaty or fanfare, but with fatigue. Cities stopped burning, but remained broken. The dreams of the 1990s had not just faded, they had been buried under years of blood and stone. What remained was a scarred land, where hope still existed, but wore armor now. Where children born under Oslo had come of age under siege. Where peace, once whispered on the White House lawn, now hid behind concrete and grief. But still, even in the rubble, seeds were scattered. And history, relentless in waiting, watched to see if anything might grow. Part 32, the 2005 Gaza disengagement. It began not with gunfire, but with orders. Not with conquest, but with retreat. In the sweltering summer of 2005, after years of bloodshed and political upheaval, Israel embarked on one of the most divisive decisions in its history, to withdraw unilaterally from the Gaza Strip. It was not the result of peace talks, not a compromise hammered out between leaders across a table. It was a decision made by Israel's leadership alone, to leave behind settlements, soldiers, and a territory long at the center of conflict. At the heart of this dramatic shift was Ariel Sharon, the prime minister who, just a few years earlier, had been the architect of military campaigns deep into Palestinian towns. He was a figure revered and reviled in equal measure, seen as a protector by many Israelis, a war criminal by many Palestinians. But now, Sharon was doing something few had imagined possible, pulling Israelis out of land they had fought to hold for nearly 4 decades. The plan was simple in theory, wrenching in practice. All 21 Israeli settlements in Gaza, home to about 8,000 settlers, would be evacuated. The military presence would be removed. The settlers would not go willingly. Many had lived in Gaza for years, raised children there, buried parents there. To them, Gaza was not just strategic. It was sacred. A part of the land they believed was eternally tied to Jewish destiny. The images that followed were unlike anything the country had seen. Israeli soldiers, young, tearful, often from the same communities, were tasked with dragging fellow Israelis from their homes. There were shouts, prayers, defiance. Some settlers locked themselves inside synagogues. Others wept as they were carried out. There were scuffles, but also moments of deep, aching humanity, soldiers embracing settlers before lifting them out. Women handing soldiers notes. Children watching their homes disappear behind them. For Palestinians watching from across the border, the moment was surreal. After decades of occupation, after countless funerals and bombings and raids, the Israeli flag was coming down from Gaza. Many poured into the vacated areas in jubilation. The abandoned settlements, once forbidden, were soon dismantled, some burned, some stripped. For the first time in decades, Gaza was free of Israeli settlers. But freedom, it turned out, was not peace. In the power vacuum that followed, Hamas gained strength. The militant organization, long at odds with the Palestinian Authority, claimed credit for forcing Israel out through resistance. In 2006, Hamas won the Palestinian legislative elections. A year later, it seized full control of Gaza in a brief but violent conflict with Fatah. What emerged was a deeply fractured Palestinian landscape, Gaza ruled by Hamas, the West Bank by the Palestinian Authority. From Israel's perspective, the withdrawal had backfired. The rocket attacks, which had persisted before the disengagement, now intensified. Towns like Sderot, just beyond Gaza's edge, found themselves under constant fire. Bomb shelters became as routine as breakfast. For many Israelis, the Gaza experiment became a cautionary tale: give up land, and get terror in return. For those on the political right, it was evidence that no withdrawal, no matter how complete, could guarantee security. Meanwhile, within Gaza, hope curdled into hardship. The blockade, imposed by Israel and Egypt, tightened. Goods became scarce. Power outages were daily. Unemployment soared. With no airport, no seaport, and limited access to the outside world, Gaza became a cage of nearly 2 million people. Protests flared. So did more rockets. The cycle that had haunted the region for generations found new fuel in the bitter aftermath of disengagement. And yet, for all the chaos it birthed, the Gaza disengagement remains a landmark moment, a line in the sand of modern Israeli history. It was the first time Israel voluntarily gave up land with settlements, not in exchange for peace, but out of sheer necessity, security calculation, or political fatigue. In the years since, debates have raged. Was it bravery or betrayal? Wisdom or weakness? Did it open a door, or slam it shut forever? There are no easy answers. only the echoes of footsteps in empty streets. The rusting signs of abandoned farms. The faces of soldiers who carried their own people away. And the question that lingers still in every negotiation, every conflict, every silence between battles. If Gaza could not be peace, what could? And in that question lies the burden of all who hope for a different tomorrow in a land so steeped in yesterday. Part 33, The Second Lebanon War, 2006. In the summer of 2006, the uneasy quiet along Israel's northern border shattered. On July 12, Hezbollah, the powerful Lebanese Shiite militia, crossed into Israeli territory, ambushing a military patrol. 3 soldiers were killed. 2 were captured and dragged across the border into Lebanon. For many Israelis, the scene echoed too closely a familiar nightmare, the painful memories of past kidnappings, of long years negotiating with enemies who refused to play by any rules. The government responded not with limited retaliation, but with full-scale war. The Second Lebanon War had begun. Israel launched airstrikes almost immediately, pounding Hezbollah positions across southern Lebanon and, controversially, in Beirut itself. Bridges, roads, fuel depots, targets both military and civilian, were destroyed as Israeli jets roared overhead. The aim was clear: cripple Hezbollah, rescue the kidnapped soldiers, and reassert deterrence after what was seen as a brazen provocation. But Hezbollah was not merely a rogue militia in hiding. Over years of preparation, it had built a complex network of bunkers and tunnels beneath villages, forests, and hills. Its fighters were embedded among civilians, armed with Katyusha rockets and guided missiles supplied by Iran and Syria. And as the Israeli Air Force struck from above, Hezbollah responded from below, launching rocket barges deeper into Israel than ever before. Towns like Haifa, Kiryat Shmona, and Nahariya fell under constant threat. Civilians huddled in bomb shelters for weeks. Sirens became a second heartbeat. More than 4,000 rockets rained down during the war, spreading terror not only in the north but across a nation that had, until then, believed itself protected by its military superiority. Israel responded with a ground invasion, sending tanks and infantry into southern Lebanon, a region it had withdrawn from just 6 years earlier. The battles were fierce, confusing, and costly. Hezbollah fighters, using guerrilla tactics honed from years of preparation, inflicted unexpected damage. Israeli tanks were hit with advanced anti-tank missiles. Troops faced ambushes in towns booby-trapped with explosives. Progress was slow, the terrain unforgiving. For the Lebanese, the war brought devastation. Over 1,000 civilians were killed, and nearly 1 million were displaced. Villages were reduced to rubble. Roads lay in ruins. The fragile post-Civil War government in Beirut, already weakened by sectarian divisions, struggled to respond. International outrage grew with each passing day, particularly over civilian casualties and the use of cluster munitions. Television screens around the world flickered with images of smoke plumes, wounded children, and funeral processions. As the war dragged on, frustration mounted in Israel. The swift victory that had been promised turned into a drawn-out campaign with unclear results. Ehud Olmert, Israel's prime minister, came under heavy criticism for lack of preparation and unclear objectives. The military was criticized for outdated tactics and poor coordination. Public confidence, so high at the war's outset, gave way to doubt. After 34 days, a UN-brokered ceasefire, Resolution 1701, went into effect. Israeli forces began to withdraw. Lebanese soldiers and UNIFIL peacekeepers moved into southern Lebanon. Hezbollah, though damaged, remained intact. The 2 kidnapped Israeli soldiers, Eldad Regev and Ehud Goldwasser, would not be returned alive. Their bodies were eventually exchanged for Lebanese prisoners in a somber swap that underscored the war's grim human toll. In Israel, the war left deep scars. Public inquiries were launched. The Winograd Commission would later criticize the government and military leadership, calling the war a failure of strategy, preparedness, and communication. Soldiers returned home disillusioned. Civilians asked if the price had been worth it. But the war also sent a message. To Hezbollah, to Iran, to the region, that while Israel may stumble, it would not sit idle when provoked. And for years afterward, the northern border remained quieter, both sides wary of sparking another fire they could not control. For Lebanon, the war exposed once again how vulnerable it remained to the ambitions of larger players. Hezbollah's popularity among some rose, particularly for its perceived defiance of Israel. But so did resentment, from others who saw their country dragged into destruction by an actor beyond their control. The Second Lebanon War was neither a clear defeat nor a true victory. It was a mirror held up to a region shaped by cycles of provocation and reprisal. A reminder that in the Middle East, wars often end not with peace, but with pause. And that beneath the rubble, new battles are always waiting to be born. Part 34, Gaza Conflicts, 2008 to 2021. The years following Israel's 2005 withdrawal from Gaza were not marked by calm, but by escalation. What was once hoped to be the beginning of a new chapter, one of separation, stability, maybe even peace, quickly unraveled into recurring cycles of war. Between 2008 and 2021, Gaza and southern Israel became locked in a grim rhythm of conflict, ceasefire, rearmament, and renewed violence. It was a pattern that unfolded not over months, but years, punctuated by brief hopes and enduring despair. The first major confrontation came in December 2008. After months of rocket fire from Gaza and a breakdown of a ceasefire between Hamas and Israel, the Israeli military launched Operation Cast Lead. It began with massive airstrikes, followed by a ground invasion. The stated goal was to weaken Hamas and stop the rockets. Over 3 weeks, more than 1,400 Palestinians were killed, many of them civilians, along with 13 Israelis, including soldiers and civilians. Entire neighborhoods in Gaza were reduced to rubble. The world watched in horror as hospitals overflowed, and families fled through smoke and dust. International reactions were mixed. Some saw Israel's actions as a legitimate defense against constant rocket attacks on towns like Sderot and Ashkelon. Others condemned the scale of the military response and the civilian toll. The war ended in January 2009 with a unilateral ceasefire, but the wounds, physical and psychological, remained raw on both sides. The calm was temporary. In November 2012, another conflict erupted, Operation Pillar of Defense. This time, the trigger was the targeted killing of Ahmed Jabari, a senior Hamas military commander. In retaliation, Hamas unleashed a barrage of rockets, reaching as far as Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, a sobering new development. Israel responded with airstrikes, and for 8 days, the skies over Gaza and Israel were filled with fire. A ceasefire was brokered by Egypt, but no lasting peace took root. Then came 2014, and with it, the deadliest and most protracted of these wars, Operation Protective Edge. It began with the kidnapping and murder of 3 Israeli teenagers, followed by the revenge killing of a Palestinian boy, and then a sharp uptick in rocket fire from Gaza. The Israeli military entered Gaza once more, aiming to destroy what it called the Terror Tunnel Network, a system of underground passages used by Hamas to infiltrate Israel. The war lasted 50 days. Over 2,200 Palestinians were killed, including hundreds of children. On the Israeli side, 73 people died, most of them soldiers. Whole sections of Gaza City, Shuja'iyah, and Rafah were turned to ruins. Infrastructure crumbled. Families were shattered. The UN later described the devastation as unprecedented in scale. The trauma echoed for years in Gaza's densely packed refugee camps, and in Israeli border towns where children ran for shelters at the sound of sirens. Between the wars, Gaza remained under blockade, by both Israel and Egypt, its economy strangled, its people trapped in a cycle of poverty and dependence. Fuel and medicine were scarce. Electricity flickered for only a few hours a day. Unemployment hovered around 50%, with little hope for improvement. For many Gazans, the horizon narrowed to survival. Yet Hamas remained in power, and so did the tension. In May 2021, another flashpoint arrived. Tensions over planned evictions in the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood of East Jerusalem and clashes at the Al-Aqsa Mosque during Ramadan sparked protests, police crackdowns, and eventually, rocket fire from Hamas. Israel launched airstrikes in response, and for 11 days, the conflict spiraled. Over 250 Palestinians and 13 Israelis were killed. Tower blocks in Gaza collapsed. Rockets pierced the Israeli defense system. Images of children pulled from rubble and burning buildings reignited international outcry. Each conflict left scars deeper than the last. Children in Gaza and Israel grew up with war as a recurring season, one that returned like a bitter winter. They learned to read between the silences, to measure days by explosions and ceasefires, to live with uncertainty etched into their bones. And through it all, leaders on both sides spoke of deterrence, defense, and destiny. But for the people beneath the bombs and between the headlines, the reality was simpler and more heartbreaking. There was no end in sight. Only a sky too often on fire. And a future still waiting to be written, somewhere beyond the smoke. Part 35, The Israel-Hamas War, 2023 to 2025. It began before dawn on October 7, 2023, with a sound that residents of southern Israel had come to dread, sirens wailing, warning of incoming rockets. But this time, something was different. As missiles streaked across the sky, another threat emerged from the ground. Hundreds of Hamas militants, heavily armed and well-coordinated, breached the border fence from Gaza, pouring into Israeli towns and kibbutzim in a sudden and brutal assault. The attackers moved swiftly, targeting civilian homes, army outposts, and public spaces. By the end of the day, over 1,200 Israelis, including entire families, had been killed in what would be described as the deadliest single attack on Israel in its history. It was a moment of horror that shocked the nation, shocked the world. Footage of the assault, including kidnappings and killings, spread across social media and news outlets like wildfire. The pain was raw, the trauma immediate. Within hours, Israel responded. The government declared a state of war, and the Israeli Defense Forces launched an extensive military campaign in Gaza. This was no limited operation, it was a full-scale war. Airstrikes lit up Gaza's skyline, targeting Hamas infrastructure, command centers, and densely populated areas. The military goal, stated clearly by Israeli leaders, was to dismantle Hamas capabilities once and for all. But as in every war, the cost quickly mounted, on both sides. In Gaza, entire neighborhoods were reduced to rubble. Hospitals overflowed with the wounded, medical supplies ran out, and electricity failed. Over the course of weeks, thousands of Palestinians, many of them civilians, lost their lives. Displacement soared. Families huddled in makeshift shelters or beneath collapsed buildings. Water became scarce. Food, medicine, hope, all ran dangerously low. International reactions were swift and divided. Some nations stood firmly with Israel, citing its right to defend itself against such an unprecedented massacre. Others condemned the scale of the response, highlighting the rising civilian death toll and humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza. Protests erupted globally, in cities from London to Jakarta, with people demanding ceasefires, justice, or accountability, depending on the banners they marched behind. Behind closed doors, diplomatic efforts surged. The United States, along with Egypt and Qatar, led urgent negotiations for a ceasefire. Weeks turned into months. Sporadic truces were declared, then shattered. Hamas continued firing rockets. Israel pushed deeper into Gaza. The war expanded into urban combat, where fighters hit among civilians, and the line between militant and non-combatant blurred into tragedy. By January 2025, nearly a year and a half into the war, a tentative ceasefire was brokered, fragile, conditional, and heavily monitored. It came at the price of over 30,000 Palestinian lives and more than 1,400 Israeli deaths, with tens of thousands injured on both sides. Gaza was left scarred beyond recognition. Israel, too, was shaken, not just militarily, but socially and politically. The war had altered everything. In Israel, grief turned to questions. How did such a breach happen? Why were communities unprotected for hours? Trust and leadership wavered. Protests erupted. Families demanded answers, not only for the lives lost but for the failures exposed. Soldiers returned from battle exhausted, many changed forever. A generation of Israelis would remember 2023 not as a date, but as a wound. In Gaza, despair settled like dust. The already crumbling infrastructure was now rubble. The economic damage was catastrophic. And though Hamas remained bloodied, it was not entirely broken. For many Palestinians, the war deepened a sense of abandonment, by the international community, by their leaders, by the promise of peace. Young children, born after 2020, had now survived their first war, and few believed it would be their last. But amid the ruin, something else lingered too, a reckoning. The war had redrawn lines, yes, but it had also reopened long-standing debates. Could Gaza remain under blockade forever? Was there any hope of reconstruction without addressing the deeper roots of the conflict? And could any ceasefire hold, if neither justice nor security felt real for those who had paid the highest price? The Israel-Hamas War of 2023 to 2025 was not merely another chapter in an old story. It was a rupture. A recalibration of pain, power, and possibility. A war that didn't just scar the land, it shifted its center of gravity. And as the bombs silenced and the dust settled, if only temporarily, the silence that followed felt as uncertain as the war itself. What came next remained unspoken. But everyone knew one thing. Nothing would ever be quite the same again. Part 36, Israel's Technological and Economic Rise. Amid the tension of borders and the weight of history, something unexpected took root in the heart of the Middle East, a digital revolution. In a country no larger than New Jersey, with no vast oil reserves and surrounded by uncertainty, Israel quietly transformed itself into a global technology powerhouse. They called it the Startup Nation, and it wasn't just a slogan. It was a reality built line by line, code by code, innovation by innovation. From the moment of its founding in 1948, Israel faced a basic truth: it could not rely on size, on natural resources, or on geographic safety. It would have to rely on something far more volatile and infinitely more powerful: human ingenuity. This reliance, born out of necessity, became the driving force behind a culture of relentless problem-solving. By the late 20th century, that culture began to evolve into something even more formidable, a high-tech ecosystem unlike any other. The roots of this boom were both strategic and organic. Mandatory military service, especially in elite intelligence units like Unit 8200, turned young Israelis into some of the most skilled cybersecurity experts on the planet. Upon leaving the army, many of these veterans didn't just take jobs, they built companies. They carried with them not only technical expertise, but also leadership skills, a network of peers, and a mindset molded by high-pressure innovation. The Israeli government, too, played a pivotal role. In the 1990s, it created incubators for high-risk ventures, offered grants for research and development, and opened the economy to global investors. This laid the groundwork for the explosion of startups in cities like Tel Aviv, Haifa, and Herzliya. Soon, the country had more startups per capita than anywhere else in the world. By the 2010s, it was attracting billions in venture capital and had become a launchpad for some of the most cutting-edge advances in agriculture, defense, cybersecurity, medical devices, and artificial intelligence. But Israel's technological rise wasn't just about money or market share, it was also about survival. In a region where water is scarce, Israeli scientists developed drip irrigation and desalination technologies that turned desert into farmland. With enemies on multiple fronts, it created the Iron Dome, a missile defense system that could shoot rockets out of the sky with astonishing precision. And in a country built by immigrants from over 100 nations, language barriers and medical needs sparked a wave of breakthroughs in health tech, enabling better diagnosis, remote care, and biotechnology. Still, for all the high-rises and headlines, Israel's economic success has also exposed deep internal divides. The benefits of this tech-driven boom have not been evenly shared. While parts of Tel Aviv resemble Silicon Valley, other communities, especially in the periphery, and among Arab Israelis and ultra-Orthodox Jews, have struggled to gain access to the same opportunities. Income inequality has widened. The housing crisis has worsened. In some sectors, automation threatens traditional employment. And critics argue that the same innovation that has fueled economic strength is also helping to entrench political power, particularly through surveillance and defense technology exports. On the global stage, however, Israel's tech sector has become a magnet. American giants like Intel, Google, Apple, and Microsoft operate major research centers there. The country has more companies listed on NASDAQ than any other outside the United States and China. In fields like quantum computing, climate tech, and autonomous vehicles, Israeli minds continue to push boundaries. And yet, for many Israelis, success is still tinged with the sobering knowledge of where it all started, from bare-bones kibbutzim and hand-dug trenches to climate-controlled labs and IPO bells ringing in New York. They know innovation here isn't just about ambition. It's about resilience. A response to challenge. A refusal to surrender. As the 21st century unfolds, Israel stands as a paradox, a land of ancient texts and augmented reality, of prophets and programmers. Its past may be measured in wars and wandering, but its present hums with the quiet confidence of code. And in the glow of screens, under the desert sun, the startup nation continues to imagine and build what comes next. Part 37, Jerusalem's Role in Global Religions. At first glance, Jerusalem does not impress with its size. There are no towering skylines, no rivers carving through its hills. And yet, it is here, in this ancient city of stone and silence, that the spiritual compass of billions tilts. Jerusalem is not just a city. It is a heartbeat. A question. A longing. Perched high in the Judean hills, Jerusalem has been at the center of human faith for over 3,000 years. To walk its narrow alleyways is to move through layers of belief, each footstep echoing with chants, prayers, and lamentations whispered across centuries. For Jews, Jerusalem is the eternal capital, the city promised, lost, wept for, and reclaimed. It was here that King David established his throne, and here that Solomon built the first temple, a golden dwelling for the divine. Though both temples are now long vanished, replaced by stone foundations and memories, the Western Wall, the last remnant of the Second Temple, still draws pilgrims who press their prayers into its crevices. It is not merely a place, it is a pulse, where the sacred brushes against the everyday. For Christians, Jerusalem is the climax of a divine story. It is where Jesus walked, preached, and prayed. It is where he was tried, crucified, buried, and, according to Christian faith, resurrected. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre, with its ancient domes and incense-choked air, stands at the heart of that narrative. Inside, pilgrims from every corner of the globe light candles, sing hymns, or fall silent in awe. For many, it is the closest they will ever come to touching the divine. And for Muslims, Jerusalem is Al-Quds, the noble sanctuary. It was to Jerusalem that the Prophet Muhammad journeyed in his miraculous night ascension, known as Isra and Miraj. From the Al-Aqsa Mosque, atop the Temple Mount, his soul is believed to have ascended to heaven. Nearby, the Dome of the Rock, with its iconic golden roof, gleams in the sun like a divine eye, watching over the city. For Muslims worldwide, Jerusalem is the third holiest site in Islam, a place of profound reverence. 3 faiths. 1 city. And therein lies the paradox. For centuries, Jerusalem has been a wellspring of devotion and a flashpoint for conflict. Kingdoms rose and fell over it. Crusades were launched in its name. Ottoman sultans ruled it. British generals marched through it. And in the modern era, it has remained at the core of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, its status both politically charged and emotionally untouchable. To declare Jerusalem one's capital is to spark debate, to pray there is often a statement, to live there can mean navigating overlapping sovereignties, divided neighborhoods, and fraught histories. The Temple Mount, in particular, crystallizes these tensions. It is both the Haram al-Sharif, home to Al-Aqsa, and the Dome of the Rock, and the holiest site in Judaism, believed to be the location of the ancient temples. Jewish prayer is restricted atop the mount to avoid inflaming tensions. Access is monitored, and any incident, no matter how small, can ripple across the region in waves of protest, violence, or political fallout. And yet, amid all this, life in Jerusalem goes on. Children laugh in the stone courtyards of the old city. Merchants sell spices and prayer beads side by side. Church bells ring out over the call to prayer. Rabbis, priests, and imams pass each other in silence or greeting, depending on the hour. Tourists follow guides down the Via Dolorosa, while Orthodox Jews hurry toward the wall. And in the quiet corners of monastic libraries and yeshivas, ancient texts are studied by flickering light. Jerusalem is, at once, a city of division and of impossible intimacy. Where else do the holiest sites of the world's major monotheistic religions exist within a few hundred meters of each other? Where else does every stone seem soaked in centuries? For believers, Jerusalem is not just sacred, it is essential. A place where heaven once touched earth. A reminder of covenant, sacrifice, and hope. And for those without faith, the city still resonates, as a symbol of our shared history, our deepest questions, and the fragile beauty of coexisting dreams. In Jerusalem, the past is not past. It breathes. It listens. It waits. And whether whispered through tears at the Western Wall, spoken in prayer within Al-Aqsa, or sung during midnight mass at the Holy Sepulchre, one truth endures. This city still holds the soul of the world. Part 38, The Jewish Diaspora and Israel's Identity. Across oceans and centuries, through pogroms, persecution, and exile, the Jewish people carried something no sword could sever, a memory of home. It may not have been a home with walls or borders, but one etched in scripture, song, and longing. From Morocco to Minsk, Baghdad to Brooklyn, this home had a name, Zion. And at its heart stood the idea of return, not just physically, but spiritually, culturally, and nationally. The Jewish diaspora is one of the most remarkable and enduring global phenomena in history. Unlike many peoples who disappeared into the tides of conquest or assimilation, Jews adapted, resisted, and survived without a sovereign land for nearly 2 millennia. They became merchants in Venice, philosophers in Spain, doctors in Cairo, and bankers in Amsterdam. They prayed facing Jerusalem, taught their children Hebrew letters, and preserved the rhythm of their holidays, Shabbat, Passover, Yom Kippur, as if time itself could hold them together. But with each generation, the question echoed louder: what does it mean to be Jewish without a homeland? That question remained open until 1948, when the State of Israel was born, not in peace, but in war. For Jews scattered across the globe, the declaration of statehood struck like lightning through centuries of wandering. Some wept, some danced, others hesitated. Could this patch of land, smaller than many American counties, truly gather the fragmented spirit of a people dispersed from Argentina to Australia? In the early decades, Israel became a magnet, drawing in Holocaust survivors with haunted eyes, Iraqi Jews fleeing persecution, Yemenite families arriving barefoot off plains. There were airlifts and sea voyages, border crossings under cover of night. The return was not always easy. The new arrivals faced economic hardship, cultural clashes, and linguistic confusion. Ashkenazi Jews from Europe often looked down on Sephardic and Mizrahi Jews from the Middle East and North Africa. Orthodox met secular. Hebrew met Yiddish, Ladino, Amharic, Russian, and more. The melting pot boiled. But out of this friction came something unique, a national identity both ancient and new. Israel became a paradox, a startup nation built on ancestral dreams. A refuge in a battleground. A homeland that struggled to define itself even as it welcomed those who claimed it. Meanwhile, many Jews in the diaspora chose not to make Aliyah, immigrate to Israel, but instead watched from afar, supporting, criticizing, defending, and debating the young nation's every move. In New York synagogues, Tel Aviv politics became Friday night topics. In Paris cafes, arguments swirled over settlements and peace plans. In South African townships, Jewish schools taught both Torah and Zionism. The diaspora was emotionally invested, but not always aligned. As decades passed, the bond between Israel and the diaspora grew more complicated. For older generations who remembered the Holocaust or Israel's founding wars, the country represented survival. For younger Jews, raised in more liberal Western societies, Israel's policies, particularly toward Palestinians, sparked difficult questions about identity, ethics, and loyalty. What does it mean to love a homeland that doesn't always reflect your values? Can one be both Jewish and critical of Israel? Is Jewishness a religion, an ethnicity, a nation, or something else entirely? Israel, too, grappled with its identity. Was it the state of all Jews, or only its citizens? What of Jews who didn't feel connected to Zionism? What of non-Jewish minorities living within its borders? Despite these tensions, the relationship between Israel and the diaspora remained profoundly intertwined. When rockets fell on Tel Aviv, synagogues in Chicago organized solidarity rallies. When anti-Semitic attacks surged in Europe, Israeli officials offered citizenship and safety. Diaspora philanthropists helped fund hospitals and schools. Israeli innovations in medicine and tech brought pride to Jews in Toronto, Berlin, and Buenos Aires. In truth, the story of Jewish identity in the modern world is incomplete without both strands, the rooted and the scattered, the Sabra, native-born Israeli, and the exile, the flag and the prayer shawl. They challenge and enrich each other. They argue at the same table. And while the idea of home may differ between a New York rabbi and a Tel Aviv engineer, they still share a language older than nations, a book read in exile and in capital cities alike, and a prayer that ends with the same hope. Next year in Jerusalem. In that hope, ancient, complicated, and ever-burning, the diaspora and Israel find their connection, not in uniformity, but in a shared past and a still unfolding future. Part 39, Geopolitical Challenges and Alliances. In the heart of the Middle East, a region where maps shift like desert sands and alliances are drawn with invisible ink, Israel walks a tightrope. Born into hostility, surrounded by neighbors who once vowed its destruction, the Jewish state has had to master the art of geopolitical survival. And more than that, it has had to transform from a lone outpost into a regional power whose influence now stretches from Washington's corridors to the Gulf's golden towers. The story of Israel's foreign relations begins with existence itself. In 1948, hours after Israel declared independence, 5 Arab armies invaded. The state's legitimacy was contested before it had time to exhale. From that moment on, diplomacy and defense were inseparable. Every handshake came with a glance toward the horizon. Every trade agreement carried the weight of history. For decades, the United States has been Israel's closest and most consistent ally. What began as diplomatic recognition evolved into one of the tightest military and political relationships in the world. Billions in aid, joint training exercises, shared intelligence, these became the foundation of a strategic partnership. American presidents, whether Democrat or Republican, reaffirmed Israel's right to defend itself. But the alliance was not without friction. Debates over settlements, peace processes, and arms sales sometimes caused strain. Still, in the halls of Congress, bipartisan support for Israel remained one of the few constants in an otherwise divided political landscape. Across the Atlantic, Europe presented a more complex picture. Nations like Germany and France maintained economic and cultural ties, while also voicing strong criticism over human rights issues and the occupation of Palestinian territories. European cities became both havens for Jewish life and flashpoints for protests against Israeli policies. And yet, the shared memory of the Holocaust ensured that diplomatic bridges, though sometimes shaky, were rarely burned. But the most dramatic shifts in Israel's geopolitical story have occurred closer to home. For decades, peace with the Arab world seemed impossible. Egypt and Jordan signed treaties, yes, but the broader region remained locked in a cold silence. Then came a series of quiet conversations, back-channel meetings, and strategic calculations. In 2020, these culminated in the Abraham Accords, a stunning diplomatic breakthrough brokered with the help of the United States. The United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Morocco, and Sudan normalized ties with Israel, opening embassies, establishing direct flights, and launching business ventures. These agreements weren't built solely on idealism, they were pragmatic, born from shared concerns over Iran, economic opportunity, and a changing global order. the Iranian shadow looms large in Israel's foreign policy. Since the 1979 Islamic Revolution, Tehran has called for Israel's destruction, funded proxies like Hezbollah in Lebanon and Hamas in Gaza, and pursued nuclear capabilities that keep Israeli defense planners up at night. Cyber warfare, covert strikes, and diplomatic pressure define this ongoing cold conflict. Israel's fear is not just of a nuclear Iran, but of a regional axis of hostility encircling it with rockets and ideology. To counter this, Israel has quietly strengthened ties with Saudi Arabia and other Gulf states, not through official treaties, but through security cooperation and mutual recognition of shared threats. These alliances, once unthinkable, suggest that the old dichotomies of Arab versus Israeli are giving way to new geopolitical fault lines: Sunni versus Shia, stability versus radicalism, growth versus stagnation. Beyond the region, India has emerged as a key partner. Shared democratic values, counterterrorism efforts, and booming tech industries have brought the two nations closer. In Africa, Latin America, and East Asia, Israel has invested in development, innovation, and diplomacy, seeking not just to survive, but to thrive in a world where alliances must be flexible and fast. Yet, amid this intricate web of friends, rivals, and strategic partnerships, Israel remains a lightning rod on the world stage. At the United Nations, it faces more resolutions of condemnation than almost any other nation. In international courts and academic circles, debates over occupation, apartheid, and human rights rage on. Activists call for boycotts. Celebrities speak out. And in an era of social media, every military action is scrutinized in real time. And still, Israel navigates. It leverages its tech economy, its military strength, and its cultural exports. It courts allies where it once had enemies. It trades goods where it once traded fire. And it does so with the knowledge that diplomacy, like history, is never static. In this ever-shifting landscape, Israel has learned the hard truth of statecraft: being right is not enough, you must also be smart, patient, and resilient. Because survival is not a given. It is earned. Every day. One handshake, one drone, one vote at a time. And so, Israel endures, not just as a state, but as a story unfolding on the world's most watched stage. Part 40, Conclusion: Why Israel Matters. In the sweep of world history, it is rare for a nation so small in geography to carry such enormous weight in story, spirit, and consequence. Israel, just a sliver of land pressed against the eastern edge of the Mediterranean, smaller than many U.S. states and crisscrossed by ancient roads and modern fault lines, has become one of the most scrutinized, admired, debated, and symbolically powerful nations on Earth. Its significance is not found in sheer numbers or natural resources. Israel has no vast oil fields, no colossal armies, no empire from which to draw pride. Instead, its gravity lies in its history, one that stretches back thousands of years to the earliest stirrings of human civilization. It lies in the sacred texts that emerged from its soil, shaping the beliefs and behaviors of billions. It lies in its survival against exile, genocide, invasion, and isolation, and in its ability to endure not just as a people, but as an idea. The Jewish people, with roots in the hills of Judea and the valleys of Galilee, have been scattered and gathered, broken and remade, countless times. Their story is one of dispersion and return, of ancient promises and modern rebirth. From the fiery prophets of the Hebrew Bible to the quiet scribes of the Diaspora, from the ghettos of Europe to the kibbutzim of Palestine, this narrative has always pointed back to a land seen not only as home, but as covenant. The modern state of Israel, founded in the shadows of the Holocaust, emerged not simply as a political solution but as a cultural reckoning. It offered refuge to survivors. It offered restoration to a language, a calendar, a rhythm of life long thought lost. And while it became a haven for many Jews, it also became a source of pain and displacement for many Palestinians. These truths are intertwined, and the region remains suspended in that complexity, of dreams fulfilled and dreams deferred. Yet beyond politics and borders, Israel occupies a unique role in global consciousness. For Christians, it is the land of Jesus and the early church. For Muslims, it is the site of the Prophet Muhammad's night journey and the third holiest mosque. For Jews, it is the center of memory and longing, etched into prayer and ritual for millennia. The stones of Jerusalem bear the weight of all three faiths, layered in devotion, tension, and awe. Israel is also a paradox, a high-tech nation with ancient festivals, a military powerhouse that invokes existential fear, a deeply religious society with one of the world's most vibrant secular cultures. It is home to startups and scholars, shepherds and scientists, poets and pilots. It is a land of contradictions, and perhaps it always has been. But why, ultimately, does Israel matter? It matters because it is a mirror, reflecting both humanity's highest aspirations and deepest divisions. It is a reminder of how sacred land can both unite and divide. It is a case study in resilience, showing how identity, when rooted in history and hope, can survive even the fiercest storms. It is a challenge to easy narratives, requiring us to hold compassion for multiple truths at once. Israel matters because it has never existed in isolation. The questions it raises, about faith and state, about exile and return, about justice and security, are not Israel's alone. They are the world's. They belong to every people who have wandered, every community that has suffered, every individual who has dared to believe in something greater than themselves. As the sun sets over the Judean hills, casting golden light over the stone walls of Jerusalem, one can feel the weight of ages pressing gently into the dust. History is not past here, it is alive, breathing in the air, echoing in the call to prayer, the laughter of schoolchildren, the silence of remembrance. And so Israel endures, not because it is perfect, but because it is deeply human. It is a land of paradox and poetry, of conflict and creativity. It is a story still being written. In the end, Israel matters because it is not just about a nation. It is about a people who refuse to vanish. It is about the enduring power of memory. And it is about the possibility, however fragile, that peace can one day grow from even the most ancient and sacred ground.